Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. This is a story about what if Deku had Overhaul Quirk Part 1. If you guys enjoy this what if and want to see Part 2, comment down below. And let me know before I start. Please do support for more awesome content and leave a like. And don't forget to subscribe to my channel. And also share this video with your friends and check out the description in my playlist. The author of the story 𝐀𝐦 𝐍𝐭 from 𝐴L3. So let's start the video. In a dressing room, the man stood still as his father adjusted his tie. He let out an annoyed sigh as the hands came down. His father sighed with his son as he silently prompted his son to sit and started tidying his hair, something that visibly annoyed the younger man. "I know, Kai. I don't want this for you either, but it's this or fighting a war we won't win." A grunt was his only answer as he began to slick the younger man's hair down with gel. He sighed. "If it makes you feel any better, the girl is being forced into this as well." "Great. So I'm marrying someone being forced into it as well. That's just perfect." Kai moved his head back to help with the styling. "Means the two of you can make an agreement about everything. Try to look at the positive side, Kai." The man finished and smiled sadly. "I wanted you to do this on your own terms, but life had other plans. So Kai, try to make the best of this." Kai nodded. Leaving the private room, he walked to the altar with his father. The presence of Hari as his best man calmed his nerves, at least a little. The presence of a close friend was definitely welcome. The happy bride hadn't arrived yet, so at least he had some time to speak with Hari before the ceremony began. "You seem uncomfortable." The silver-haired male lifted a brow and looked over his friend. "You're one to talk." He turned back to the crowd. "I'm surprised it's Western-themed. Her parents planned the whole thing. Want everything to go their way." Kai gave a disinterested look towards the crowd, only to receive a glare from the father of the bride and a worried look from his own father. He would have glanced away had the bride not begun her walk down the aisle. She was around his age by the looks of it, unless her makeup made her look younger than she was. She had light green hair and dark green eyes. Her smile was just as forced as he knew his must be. He wished he could wear his surgical mask. She was handed to him, and they both turned to the priest. 𝐴𝐻𝐿, you said? The bride-to-be started. "I know what I said. But all your siblings are already married or too young. We need you to unite our groups. Bring honor to our family." Her mother spoke sharply, leaving no room for discussion as she continued applying makeup to her daughter's cheeks. Once she was finished, her daughter spoke again. "But you promised." Tears pricked at her eyes. "𝐴𝐻𝐿, if you cry, I will give you a different reason to cry." Her mother spoke harshly with a scowl. 𝐴𝐻𝐿 sniffed and wiped at her, luckily, dry eyes. No makeup was on them just yet as her mother was working on the basic makeup currently. 𝐴𝐻𝐿 gave a frown as she felt her mother start going towards her eyes. She closed them in sadness. She couldn't look at her mother anymore. Not after this. 𝐴𝐻𝐿 wasted no time washing all of the makeup off her face in a bathroom sink after the ceremony. She could tell that her husband wasn't any happier about their wedding than she was. She looked towards him to see him speaking on the phone with someone, the name Hari coming up on occasion. 𝐴𝐻𝐿 felt disgusting. This is going to suck, isn't it? Most likely. Ground rules, a silence. Don't touch me without my express permission, and I will do the same to you. All right. 𝐴𝐻𝐿 felt a hand patting her back as she lost her lunch into the toilet. One of Kai's workers, Hari, was holding her hair back and attempting to soothe her stomach. 𝐴𝐻𝐿 was grateful for that. She knew why she was vomiting. It was part of her parents' stupid deal. The merger wouldn't actually happen unless she had a baby. That night she drank too much to try and forget. It worked a little. She only remembered half of it. Luckily, all of the parts that she wanted to forget were a black blur, so she had decided that the massive hangover she suffered the next morning was worth it. "Do you want me to tell Kai?" Hari asked her calmly. 𝐴𝐻𝐿 thought for a second before nodding. Hari stood up and grabbed a hair tie to hold her hair back before he left. 𝐴𝐻𝐿 reached a shaking hand back to feel the ponytail, which held firmly. A few seconds later the light from the doorway was blocked out. Kai watched her with that same damn emotionless expression he always had. It was starting to piss 𝐴𝐻𝐿 off. "So, you think it might be morning sickness? Why else would I tell you that I've been vomiting?" He was silent. "Can you at least send someone to get a test from a store?" 𝐴𝐻𝐿 dry heaved. Her throat and chest burned, but there was nothing really left to come up. After a few seconds, Kai nodded and left. 𝐻𝐡𝐚𝐭 felt a bit of relief at that. If she was with child, she would never have to drink to forget another day of her life. She was sure 𝐸 would be relieved as well. By the time a half hour had passed, Hari returned, handing her a pregnancy test, and then stepping out to let her take it. She attempted to strike up a conversation while waiting for the results, but it was mostly one-sided. She guessed he was more of a listener than a talker. She looked at the small stick and let out a sigh of relief. 2 lines. Hari looked towards her inquiringly. Tell 𝐸 it's positive. Hari nodded and walked off. 𝗳𝗲𝗃 after 9 months and a thankfully quick labor, 𝐻𝐚𝐭 held her son for the first time. Small, dark green curls decorated his head. His eyes were closed, but she could tell he was a handsome baby boy. She gave him a small kiss on his forehead. She sat up straighter and watched her parents come in. They made small comments and talked about possible quirks. Both 𝐸 and 𝐻𝐚𝐭 exchanged looks of disgust, but for very different reasons. The infant suddenly decided that now would be the best time to finally open his eyes. 𝐻𝐽's breath hitched at the sight. His eye shape was the same as 𝐸's. His right eye was gold and his left was green. He seemed to have just as much emotion she did. Seeing those same eyes that she had gotten so used to seeing emotionless filled to the brim with wonder and amazement made her cry. She leaned down and pressed her forehead to her son's, who giggled and made small noises. 𝗳𝗲𝗃 noticed 𝐸's avoidance of her and their son, Izuku. She didn't really mind. In fact, she preferred it. She didn't want 𝐸 making Izuku just as emotionless as he was. The merger had finally become official, and seeing a few familiar faces was nice. A few of her father's subordinates had tried to get 𝐸 to act like a father. If her father's complaints about deaths was anything to go off of, they had been killed for daring to tell 𝐸 what to do. 𝐻𝐚𝐭 was currently sitting on the couch with Izuku on one of her legs. Her leg was bouncing, much to the amusement of the giggling 2-year-old. It was a sweet sound that she had grown to love. She stopped and grabbed her phone. One arm curled around her son, and the other held her phone out to snap a photo. 𝐻𝐽 pulled the phone to her and looked at the photo. Izuku had a look of confusion on his face as he looked dead into the camera. In fact, he was even reaching out to it. She looked at herself and laughed slightly at her messy bun and her face that looked like she had cooed at her baby. There was a third person in the picture. It was 𝐸. He had entered the room from the hallway and had a slightly surprised look on his face. He must have seen the camera right as the picture was taken. He had photobombed the duo. 𝐻𝐚𝐭 didn't care much. She decided that it could count as a family photo. She already had plans for it. Hikoichi, 𝐸's father, followed his son in. He made his way to 𝐻𝐽 and Izuku, who happily squealed and reached for his grandfather. Hikoichi laughed and, after 𝐻𝐽 nodded, picked the 2-year-old up. How is my favorite grandchild doing? The toddler let out a happy squeal as Hikoichi sat down next to 𝐻𝐽. You've been getting bigger. Hikoichi saw 𝐻𝐽 smile from the corner of his eye. Oh 𝐻𝐽, your father wants to talk to you. It's part of the reason I came here. 𝐻𝐽 sighed. She didn't want to talk to him. I can watch Izuku until you get back. At least she didn't have to withhold her emotions here. She stood up, gathered herself, and walked to his office. Izuku reached out for his mother with a saddened look, mumbling small words. Hikoichi quickly got his grandson's attention. Izuku, the toddler looked at him. Hikoichi looked around the room for 𝐸. Seeing his son wasn't in the room, he stood up with his grandson and walked out back. Do you want to see the cherry blossoms? Hikoichi chuckled as the toddler's eyes widened and he nodded. Hikoichi looked up towards the tree and watched the petals dance in the wind. Izuku's eyes widened and he grabbed a few petals in his hand. When he opened his fist, the petals flew out and Hikoichi laughed. Why? Izuku asked, moving his hand and seemingly trying to figure out why the petals were gone. The wind blew them away, little one. Hikoichi answered, but he was expecting the classic why questions to happen. Why? Green and gold eyes looked up at red eyes in wonder and confusion. Wonder was more prominent. Well, the flower petals are loose on the tree, so if the wind is strong enough, it will blow them off, making a beautiful scene. He knew that it was a bit more complicated than that, but Izuku was only 2 years old. Why? Why what? Why does wind happen? Hikoichi gave his grandson a look, seeing the same look in his grandson's eyes that 𝐸 got when he just found something new to learn about. He shook his head and smiled. I'm not sure. Why do you think it happens? I don't know. Well, Maybe you can ask your mother to look it up for you when she gets back. Izuku smiled and went back to grabbing flower petals. Only once did he try to eat one. Luckily, 𝐬𝐻𝐸 knew that toddlers like putting things in their mouths. �tilde, are you sure? Kai spoke sharply. Hari nodded. The sawdust that used to be the coffee table definitely makes it seem like yours, Kai. The silver-haired man had only been in the room for a few seconds, but it had been long enough for the tiny 3-year-old to notice him, put his hands on the coffee table, and turn the table into a pile of sawdust, which had sent Izuku falling into it. 𝐬𝐻𝐸 and 𝐴𝐴 were dealing with cleaning it up and making sure Izuku was okay. Kai sighed. He didn't really want to deal with his son, but then he began thinking. 𝐬𝐻𝐸 had said that Izuku was developing fast for his age, quickly taking in any information he could find no matter the subject. Kai had hoped that the kid would be quirkless, disease-free, but he supposed that if the world had decided that Izuku would have the same disease Kai had, then so be it. Then Kai suddenly realized something. Maybe Izuku had his disease for a reason, to carry the torch when it was time. His interest sparked, he put down his current project and walked past Hari into the living room. Izuku's front was covered in sawdust, his hair having specks left in it despite 𝐀𝐻𝐸's best efforts to clean the dust off of him with a lint roller. 𝐬𝐻𝐸 was sweeping it all into a pile. The man looked up and spoke. Ah, Kai, 𝐀𝐻𝐸 tensed. Did Hari tell you what happened? Kai nodded before speaking. Yes, so he has my quirk, 𝐬𝐻𝐸 nodded. And his mother's. We thought it was just that one because he pulled a puzzle piece towards him. But it seems he has both. A hand ruffled Izuku's hair and pulled back with some sawdust on it. Kai nodded. He looked towards his son, who was watching him with wide eyes. Kai does admit the kid looks like him in a way. Izuku, his son looked at him. Do you want to learn how to overhaul correctly? Kai saw Izuku's eyes widen, and then he nodded eagerly, much to 𝐀𝐻𝐸's distress. I'll teach you later on in the week when I have the time. Kai turned and left. Dad is gonna teach me stuff, Izuku proudly spoke. 𝐬𝐻𝐸 ruffled his grandson's dusty hair once more. 𝐀𝐻𝐸 didn't think she had ever been more terrified. Hari sat by his window as he watched the flashes of light from the thunder and lightning. He always liked watching the rain. He found it soothing. His door creaked open and Hari looked over to see a small 3-year-old. Izuku padded into his room slowly, dragging a blanket behind him. Hari tilted his head and patted the floor next to him. Izuku quickly sped over after another crash of thunder. Izuku's hands found themselves knotting into Hari's shirt. It's just a storm, Izu-kun. Hari rubbed the toddler's back lightly. He had a soft spot for kids. It was part of the reason he liked to help 𝐀𝐻𝐸 with Izuku, having volunteered to watch Izuku whenever she was on a trip, much like tonight. Both Kai and 𝐀𝐻𝐸 had to leave for different missions. 𝐬𝐻𝐸's health wasn't as good as it used to be, and he slept with his door locked, and like a rock. He looked out the window one more time before standing up and laying down in his bed with the scared toddler. Izuku whimpered slightly when Hari turned on a lamp on his nightstand. Izu-kun, it's just a storm, you're safe indoors. Hari wrapped the tiny boy up in his blanket. Izuku looked up with an unsure look. He laid down as Hari got under his covers and turned off the light. You're safe because everyone here wants to protect you. Izuku gave a small nod and buried his face in his blanket. Hari chuckled slightly and watched Izuku drift off. Izuku definitely seemed nothing like Kai at the moment, but Hari had a feeling that would change in a few years. Hari soon drifted to sleep as well. Izuku bounced slightly as he followed his grandfather closely as they walked into the theater. Having gotten their drinks and popcorn, which Izuku had asked to help hold, they sat in their seats as the movie began. After the movie, they took a walk to an ice parlor. Izuku sat in a booth and tapped the table with gloved hands. The gloves were black and prevented accidental quirk use. Of course, Overhaul could destroy them easily, so he had several pairs. 𝐬𝐻𝐸 came back with 2 sundaes. He gave one to Izuku, who dug in immediately. 𝐬𝐻𝐸 sat down next to Izuku and started eating his own. Careful, Izuku, you don't want to get a brain freeze, 𝐬𝐻𝐸 warned. He mentally chuckled at the memory of when Kai and Hari got their first ever brain freezes. Hari seemed like he had been hit by his own quirk. Kai overhauled the spoon he was using along with a bit of his own arms. Izuku didn't heed the warning, and a few seconds later the gloves on his hands were gone. 𝐬𝐻𝐸 laughed and patted his grandson's head. Here, take your thumbs and push them on the top of your mouth. It'll help. Izuku gave a confused look but did it. A few seconds later, it seemed like the brain freeze was gone, and Izuku went right back to eating his treat. The old man chuckled and went back to eating his own, enjoying spending time with his tiny little grandson. He wished his daughter would have a child of her own, but she wasn't in a relationship at the moment, and he wasn't going to rush her to get in one. 𝐻𝐸 had practically disowned her own family after Izuku was born, refusing them the right to even see Izuku. Hikoichi soon finished his ice cream and threw his plastic bowl and spoon away, with Izuku following suit a few seconds later. Hikoichi smiled and held a hand out for the boy. The two walked out of the parlor and into the mall. Eventually, they stopped at a toy store and Hikoichi pulled a kid's cart from the rack. He gently poked Izuku with it. "Here, go get toys you like. I'll be right here if you need me." Hikoichi watched his grandson quickly sped off into the aisles. Izuku began looking at the shelves in wonder, pushing his cart in front of him. He was in the Lego section and was looking for more building blocks for a certain little project he had been working on. He found what he was looking for and placed the boxes in his cart before moving to another aisle. He picked up a water gun colored with blue and red and placed it in his cart. He started on his way back to his grandfather, only to have his cart slam into another. "Hey, watch it, broccoli head." Izuku looked up and saw spiked blonde hair on a toddler who seemed to be the same age as him. Red eyes glared at him. "Well, move you piece of shit," who also didn't have a filter. Izuku moved and watched the boy go down the aisle he was just in and shook his head. He decided that he didn't like that boy. Turning back, Izuku continued on his way to the counter. Hikoichi tried to ignore the woman talking to him. She had managed to see his Yakuza marks when he moved his sleeve to scratch an itch and was asking him so many questions that he was getting annoyed. Luckily, Izuku came over and was ready to leave, so he moved to the checkout and placed the items on the counter as Izuku put his cart back. Hikoichi gave a quick goodbye to the woman and left with Izuku and the purchased toys before she could say anything. Izuku couldn't hold his excitement as Hari led him to his father's lab. It was finally time for his first quirk lesson with Overhaul. He smiled as the door opened and peeked inside. Kai was messing with something on the counter. He turned to see who entered and after seeing Izuku, gestured to a chair at the far wall, and Izuku took the hint and sat in it. A few seconds later, Kai handed Izuku a sharp piece of wood. "Can you tell me what all this is made out of?" Izuku gave a look of confusion. Kai was already annoyed by this lesson. "Use your quirk." The last word seemed to come out strained, as if Kai wanted to say something else. The 3-year-old quickly nodded and black lines appeared on the wood. The lines retracted soon after. The brunette watched the greenette with a bored gaze. "It's made out of really tiny things. Those are atoms. I guess I have to explain them a bit before we can get further." "Okay." 𝐻𝐸 held her baby as he blew out his candles. 4 lights disappeared as he happily blew them out. Cake was given out to those who wanted it. Presents were opened, talks happened, and the birthday boy fell asleep on his mother. All in all, it was a good birthday. It wouldn't last forever. A puzzle piece slowly floated towards a small hand as 3 people sat at a table around a puzzle. Hari peered at the floating piece and smiled when it reached the 4-year-old's open hand. "You've been getting better at that, Izuku-kun." The toddler squealed as Hari ruffled his hair. "With enough practice, you can probably pull a book towards you like your mom." Hari smiled as Izuku smiled wide and placed the puzzle piece in its correct place. "First try, little boss. Good job." A small bird-shaped doll spoke while holding the box cover and showing it to the other 2. "Looks almost done too. 76%. The 3 continued on their little mission to complete the puzzle as Hari pondered. 𝐻𝐸 had left on a week-long job today after saying her goodbyes to Izuku, leaving Hari in charge of the tiny tot in her absence. Aranaka Joy, or Mimic, often joined in watching over the kid, seeing how cute the 4-year-old was. That backfired due to his choice of living in a bird doll, and nowadays, it wasn't an uncommon sight to see Izuku carrying Mimic around like the doll he was mimicking. Suddenly, the door slammed open, causing Izuku to yelp and stare at the door with wide, teary eyes. Hari picked the toddler up. People normally knocked, meaning, "We're under attack." There was a problem. Hari glanced towards Mimic and gave him a knowing look as he ran to a wall of Izuku's room. Tears started flowing from Izuku's eyes as the child looked around frantically. Mimic jumped out of his doll and ran over to the wall, using his quirk to become a door. Hari opened it and entered the wall. It was tight, but he could fit. Mimic handed him an emergency flashlight before closing the door and running out of the room to join the fight. Hari heard both fighting and Izuku's fearful sobs. He was worried about the latter. They would be found if he didn't calm the boy down. "Izuku," the tot looked up at him. "Can you stop crying? We'll get found." It was a stupid request, but he figured it was worth a shot. Thankfully, it seemed to work. Izuku nodded and latched even tighter onto Hari. His sobs slowly subsided, but the shaking of the 4-year-old said he was still crying but trying to stay quiet. Hari felt awful. Hari shifted slightly in the wall. He didn't know how long they had been there. At one point, he had managed to sit down and had Izuku in his lap. The small greenette's face turned towards the wall. The 4-year-old had somehow managed to fall asleep despite the noise caused by the fighting, even if it was dying down. Soon the sounds of fighting stopped and Hari heard a door open with a frantic shout. "Where is he?" The shout woke Izuku, and his silent tears quickly returned. Hari stood up with the boy in his arms and watched the area in front of him slowly open. "He's right here, boss," Mimic said as he let them out. Izuku was clinging to the arrow-haired man and didn't even reach for his father. He knew better. Kai seemed to calm down and gave them a curt nod before leaving the room. Mimic was out of his doll still and patted Izuku's head. "Sorry for that, little boss." Hari sighed silently. He knew Kai only viewed his son as a successor. The man only interacted with the kid whenever he was training with Overhaul. Kai didn't help care for Izuku, barely talked to him, and didn't waste time with him. It was surprising Izuku still held his father in a positive light. Though, that could be because Kai humored the boy's endless questioning during Quirk training. Rubbing the kid's back, Hari walked over to Izuku's bed and sat on the edge. He laid the 4-year-old down and tucked him in. A weak protest escaped Izuku as the blanket covered him. Mimic hopped onto the bed as well, back in his doll, and walked over to Izuku. The toddler held one of Hari's arrows in a death grip, avoiding the tip of the arrow, and grabbed Mimic as well. It was obvious he didn't want them to leave, so they stayed until Izuku was fast asleep. Well, Mimic was stuck until Izuku woke up, but Hari managed to get away after the toddler's grip loosened. 𝐬𝐻𝐸 ran through the hallways in a hurry. Hikoichi had called her about the attack and told her to come home. She was needed to help calm Izuku. The toddler refused to leave Hari alone and was carrying Mimic everywhere. Soon enough, she arrived in front of her son's room and quickly opened the door as she slid to a stop in front of her son, kneeled down and scooped the 4-year-old up into a much-needed hug. The silent shaking of the toddler was enough to make her cry. Mimic remained silent in Izuku's grip as he listened to his boss's wife and son cry in happiness at their reunion. They needed it, and he felt lucky that he was not sandwiched between the two. 𝐬𝐻𝐸 eventually managed to free Mimic, who gave her a small bow in return before leaving the room, and sat on her son's bed with him in her lap. His shakes had subsided, but Izuku's grip on her didn't loosen for a long time, and neither did hers. Izuku woke up in Mimic's arms and was being carried by the man, the empty doll lying on his shoulder. He looked and saw his mom talking to his grandfather a bit away. He smiled and moved to get comfortable in the arm, holding him. "Morning, little boss. Did you sleep well?" After the toddler nodded, Mimic bounced him once and continued on his mission to get the kid some breakfast, even though it was nearing lunchtime. "Do you want to go outside and play with some of your new toys? I saw you got a water gun." Izuku nodded as Mimic put him into a seat and began to eat. Hari held up the piece of wood he had found on the side of the house, the one place that never got cleaned. He held it up as he filled Izuku's water gun, dropping a few ice cubes in there as well. The sound of water hitting wood sounded off along with a squeal, and quickly the gun was taken from Hari and aimed at Mimic, who yelped as ice-cold water hit his thigh, and quickly responded by spraying Izuku with the hose. "And this is Hari, a worker of mine." Turning around but keeping the piece of wood pointed at the battle behind him, Hari looked at the voice. Kai was standing in the doorway as someone with short blonde hair stood right in front of him. The blonde was watching the battle, but turned to Hari. "Hari, this is Minamoto-shin. He'll be working with us on our goal." Kai seemed unfazed at the water fight that was unfolding. "If you aren't too busy, I would like you to show him around." The glass door closed quickly. Minamoto looked at the closed door. "Does he not go outside often?" The silver-haired man shook his head no. "He's germophobic," Hari stated. "Unfortunately, So is Izuku, but not as badly. Hari mumbled the last part. What was that? I said. It suddenly felt like someone grabbed Hari's throat. Unfortunately, so is Izuku, but not as badly. A hand flew to his throat and Hari gasped as the feeling went away. He looked at Shin, who seemed confused. Who's Izuku? The feeling returned. Maybe it was his quirk. My godson. That wasn't what he wanted to say, but it was true. He was Izuku's godfather. Kai had told him that. He guessed that being childhood best friends with him was part of the reason. Maybe Minamoto forced people to tell the truth? Shin nodded. He looked Hari up and down before speaking again. Why the hell are you holding a piece of wood? Before the feeling could return, a small cheerful voice piped up. 'Cause we're having a water battle. Shin turned to the voice and saw no one. Down here, silly. Sure enough, looking down showed that Izuku was only a few feet from Shin, water gun in hand. Once Shin jolted, the gun was pointed up, and a wicked grin split Izuku's face. The scream of pure shock was worth Hari staying quiet. The surprise and shock from a 4-year-old spraying him was the only thing that stopped Shin from smacking the kid. The adult who sprayed him afterwards was on his shit list though. That's why I'm holding a piece of wood. Izuku left the two to chat as he continued to run from Mimic as fast as his legs could move. Eventually, he used one of the sakura trees for cover, and an idea popped into his head. Izuku grabbed a fistful of tree and used his quirk. Lines shot up the bark and handholds formed, which Izuku used to climb up the center. Soon he felt something bright shine in his eyes and looked towards it. A sunset met his gaze. Green and golden eyes widened in wonder. Just over the fence, there were so many buildings, people in costumes walked the streets. On occasion, they would take pictures with random people they got approached. Izuku stared in wonder, listening to the new sounds, watching the people in costumes, watching cars drive past, watching the non-costumed people snap. Izuku watched the view disappear behind the fence as he felt nothing under his feet. He heard a scream. Suddenly, he felt something warm on his back and his freefall stopped. He met eyes with a panicked Mimic and saw Hari looking on in horror. The new guy just seemed to be confused. I saw people in costumes. I saw over the fence. It was really pretty. Mimic let out a sigh of relief and stood up. He stared at his wet, grass-stained shirt and Izuku's own soaked clothes. Kurono, can you go get 2 towels? I have to turn the hose off. The man set the toddler down, and after a quick head pat on a fluffy patch of green, left. The green-haired toddler giggled and walked to the door, watching Hari go inside. Eventually, he set his eyes on the new guy. Shin tapped his foot a bit. He didn't want to babysit a brat. What's your name, mister? Shin looked towards the voice, before jolting. The kid had the same eye shape as Chisaki. Hell, even one of his eyes were gold. Was this his kid? I'm Minamoto Shin. That's a cool name. Shin used his quirk. He knew kids lied often, and he wanted the truth. What's your name? The toddler looked up at him and smiled. It wasn't the same wicked smile as before. It was sweet and innocent. It fit him more than the other smile. Chisaki Izuku. The blonde tensed. That was true. This kid was somehow related to Chisaki, his savior, and was the complete opposite. How was he related? A younger sibling? A son? Not only that, his name was Izuku, Kurono's godson. How are you related to Chisaki-sama? You mean dad or mama? Well, that narrows it down. Maybe Chisaki-sama had a sister. The one with gold eyes. That's my dad. Shin thanked whatever force stopped him from smacking the toddler earlier. It explained the other 2 adults' panic, and why they acted the way they did when the branch snapped. Why there even was a kid here. He paled. He almost smacked Chisaki-sama's kid. He could have died. You just realized it, didn't you? An amused voice spoke. Turning towards it showed it was Mimic. Kurono has known since before Izuku was even born. I figured it out after a day, almost a year ago. Kurono had been here that long, explained how he was the kid's godfather. As if he could sense that he was being talked about, Hari returned. He tossed a towel to Mimic and Shin, and started to help dry Izuku off. Did you behave for Minamoto? Shin looked over at hearing his name. He saw the kid nod and listened to the kid giggle. There was no way this was Chisaki-sama's biological kid. He was too joyful, pure. Shin couldn't decide on one. Hari picked up Izuku and carried him on his hip. The toddler latched onto him. Let's get you cleaned up and dressed. Can't let your father get angry with you for not being clean. Izuku turned to the others and waved. Bye, Mr. Minamoto, bye, Mimic. Izuku walked towards his father slowly. He knew not to bounce near him, not to be excited, energy-filled. Dad? Knew to never call him anything but Dad. No Papa, no Pops, no Daddy. Just Dad. Kai looked at his son. He took in how clean Izuku was and gave a bit of attention to him as a reward. Yes? Can you take me past the fence? Or could Mimic or hurry? It looked filthy. The room went silent. Izuku blinked. Outside the fence was filthy. But he didn't see any trash. Wha? It's filthy. You can't go past the fence too much. You'll get sick. Izuku looked at his father. He'd get sick? Izuku hadn't gotten sick a lot. Then again, he rarely left the house. So maybe it's true. When can I leave to go explore? Kai stood up. When you're older. You have my immune system, and thus, when you're older it'll be stronger. Now, come on. It's time for your next lesson. Nodding, Izuku followed and watched Kai bring out a key and unlock his lab door. He opened it, and Izuku walked in. The lights came on. In the corner was a gold and brown mess of fur. A small 3-month-old puppy, shivering and growling in the corner, with its front right leg bent the wrong way. Izuku looked up at his father in confusion. He heard Kai click his tongue in annoyance as the man closed the door behind them. This mutt's leg is broken. Why? A sharp glare silenced Izuku, and Izuku looked down and refused to look his father in the eye. Someone kicked it. The toddler made a small noise of realization and slowly inched towards the dog. He stopped completely when it growled and bared its teeth, its tail tucked against its stomach. It's angry. Well, obviously. Its leg had been broken just an hour ago. It's had its leg broken. Of course it is. Kai responded. Izuku looked up with a questioning look. Dad, a spark of fear ran across Izuku's face. Did you break its leg? Kai's eyes widened. That surprised Izuku enough to make him flinch back towards the mutt, who tried to bite him. Izuku quickly jumped forwards in shock and bumped into Kai's legs. A single mumbled sorry was heard. Kai was still a bit surprised. Izuku had made that guess off of just what he had said. He cleared his throat and gave a quick answer. This is part of your lesson today. He watched as a look of confusion spread across Izuku's face once more. Kai internally sighed. He didn't realize that raising a kid, let alone a successor, would be this draining. Use Overhaul to heal the break. The look of shock and the wild shaking of his son's head in response did not help Kai's already thin patience. Why? The word came out harshly. You told me not to use it on living things cause it'll hurt them. Right. He had said that after Izuku's first lesson. But that was to prevent him from killing or maiming someone. He didn't need a traumatized successor. I said that as a safety precaution. It wasn't a good answer to Izuku, who shook his head once more. What's wrong this time? But it'll hurt it. Kai groaned. This was getting them nowhere. He argued back and forth with Izuku over what was right and what was wrong. How hurting living things was wrong. Izuku, the toddler jolted. Yes, it hurts at first, but only for a short amount of time. Now you just have to heal the leg, and it'll be happy at being able to walk again. Kai explained, maybe now Izuku will try to heal the mutt. This defiance was trying his patience, which was wearing dangerously thin. But I don't. A loud smack rang through the lab. A toddler fell to the floor with a yelp, and an adult huffed in rage and annoyance. Kai glared at his son. Izuku turned to him with tears in his eyes and held his cheek. A red handprint started to form on the cheek he was holding. Kai itched the back of his right hand. I gave you one simple task. It would have been an easy, quick lesson on how to properly overhaul a broken bone. Would you have preferred me to break one of yours and show you how to heal it? Kai's eye twitched as he yelled. Izuku shook with fear and from crying. His cheek hurt and his father looked terrifying, as if a monster had been released. He watched Kai leave to another part of his lab and work on something else. Izuku stayed on the floor and silently sobbed. He didn't want to make any noise in case the monster possessing his father came back. He didn't move until something wet and warm touched his arm. He slowly looked over and saw that the puppy had limped to him and was currently licking his arm. Izuku picked it up and ran to his room. He didn't want to see anyone. 𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀. Izuku looked at his door when it opened and quickly bolted to his mother. Inko knelt down and looked in shock at the bruise on her son's cheek, and the injured dog. Her rage flared. How dare he? How dare he? 𝐬𝐻𝐿, I'll be right back. The toddler looked up. Mama has to go talk to a few people. 𝐬𝐻𝐿 nodded and let her go, crawling back onto his bed. 𝐀𝐦 stomped into 𝐀𝐻's lab. The man was still steaming in the corner. What the hell is wrong with you? 𝐀𝐦 stood in front of 𝐀𝐻, staring him in the face. 𝐀𝐻 scowled. I gave him a punishment for not listening to me when I told him to do something. He's 4. He doesn't know any better. 𝐀𝐦 jabbed a finger at 𝐀𝐻, careful enough to not touch him. Well, now he will. 𝐀𝐻 stood straight up and towered over the smaller woman. He now knows he'll get punished for not listening. 𝐀𝐦 looked ready to either pull her hair out or strangle the brunette in front of her. She left the lab, slamming the door. 𝐀𝐻 rolled his eyes. 𝗳𝗲𝗃, this is the first time someone has ever hit him, 𝐀𝐦 complained to 𝐬𝐻𝐻. The man seemed a bit horrified at the story 𝐀𝐦 told but sighed. 𝐀𝐻's always had a short temper. 𝐬𝐻𝐿 must have hit his limit. He'll calm down in a bit and rethink what just happened. The explanation didn't sit well with 𝐀𝐦. Was 𝐬𝐻𝐻 defending 𝐀𝐻? The thought of 𝐬𝐻𝐿 getting hit again hurt 𝐀𝐦 as well. She huffed and left the room. 𝐬𝐻𝐻 flinched at the slamming door. His office was quiet. 𝐀𝐦, please don't do anything rash. As 𝐀𝐦 strode into 𝐬𝐻𝐿's room, the small bump in his sheets told her that he had fallen asleep. She moved to his closet and grabbed the 2 bags in it. He had only ever used them to carry small toys whenever 𝐬𝐻𝐻 took him out of the house to get fresh air. She packed one full of some of his clothes. A few toys snuck in between the layers. She put the bag of clothes on the bed and placed 𝐬𝐻𝐿's towel at the bottom of the other. She offered her hand to the dog, who slowly sniffed it before laying its head back down. 𝐀𝐦 gently picked the poor animal up and placed her in the second bag. 𝐀𝐦 shook the lump under the blanket and spoke softly. 𝐬𝐻𝐿, a tiny groan. He was going to be cranky. We're going to go explore 𝗧𝗵𝗲. That got 𝐬𝐻𝐿 to wake up. Here, the puppy can come too. She helped 𝐬𝐻𝐿 into warm clothes and his shoes, and put the clothes-filled backpack on his back and the one with the dog on his front. She held his hand as they walked to the front door. 𝐀𝐦 only had one thought in her mind. She should have done this a long time ago. 𝗳𝗲𝗃 let out a sigh as he sat at his desk. Maybe he should have listened to what 𝐬𝐻𝐿 was trying to say. He shouldn't have smacked 𝐬𝐻𝐿 so hard either. 𝐬𝐻𝐿 had deserved a punishment for disobeying, but he supposed that a backhand across the face was too harsh. He stood up and pushed his chair in. Making his way to 𝐬𝐻𝐿's room, he began thinking of how he would apologize to the boy. Maybe a trip outside to a movie, like 𝐬𝐻𝐻 did on occasion, or maybe a trip to a museum or aquarium. Something outside and educational. Come to think of it, he'd have to start homeschooling 𝐬𝐻𝐿 soon. He was almost 5. He opened the door and looked inside, only to see the room was empty. It was 10 p.m. It shouldn't have been empty. He walked to check 𝐀�'s room. He realized he had rarely been to her room. In fact, he may never have been to it. He wasn't sure. As he walked past a window, he saw movement. He stopped and did a double take. He focused and was able to make out a head of familiar green hair moving away from the compound. The rage from earlier came back in full force, and he immediately stormed over to Hari's room. He threw the door open and spooked the silver-haired male. 𝐀𝐦 is a traitor. She's running away with 𝐬𝐻𝐿. 𝗳𝗲𝗃 heard the gate opening behind her and paled. 𝐬𝐻𝐿, run in front of Mama. The toddler took off while 𝐀𝐦 stayed at a jog. She heard the running footsteps behind her and shivered, but she didn't slow down. She knew that 𝐀𝐻 would murder her once he got his hands on her. Figuratively and literally. She had to make sure 𝐬𝐻𝐿 would never be found, not by 𝐀𝐻. 𝐬𝐻𝐿 was still in earshot, so she shouted, 𝐬𝐻𝐿, go right. When she saw 𝐬𝐻𝐿 follow her instructions, she sighed lightly in relief before taking her own right into the next alley. 𝗳𝗲𝗃 legs hurt. He didn't know why they'd had to run. He looked behind himself and saw that his mother was nowhere to be seen. His thought was cut short as he slammed into someone's leg, causing him to fall over. He looked up and met yellow eyes hidden behind a pair of glasses. The man had green hair with yellow streaks and had been talking with a tall buff man with yellow hair. 𝐬𝐻𝐿 teared up and rubbed his hands. He got dirty. Dad was going to be angry. Nightie, was it? The blonde spoke. Can you take this kid to a police station while I try to figure out what he was running from? The green-haired adult nodded before picking 𝐬𝐻𝐿 up and carrying him away from the alley. "You'll find Mama, right?" Izuku's voice was quiet, and he ignored the urge to scratch at the areas the man had touched. It was confusing. Only Hari and Mama picked him up whenever he was dirty. "I'll do my best, kiddo." The blonde spoke before squeezing into the alleyways to try and find 𝐻𝐻𝐿. "Okay." Night-Eye did not like how quietly this kid had spoken, or how he didn't make a noise while crying. Most kids his age would be crying their eyes out after being separated from their mothers. He walked with the kid in his arms to a nearby police station and entered quietly. "Got a lost child. All Might is looking for his parents." Night-Eye placed the kid on one of the plastic chairs and took off the backpacks, placing them on nearby chairs. He saw one of the bags twitch and watched it for a moment before unzipping it and looking inside to meet brown eyes and golden fur. A dog. Night-Eye shifted the backpack onto its side so the dog would be laying down. "Got it." A black-haired man walked over, bending down a bit to be at eye level with a toddler. "I'm Detective Tsukachi. Can you tell me your name?" Green and gold flickered up at the two adults near him. "Izuku, Chisaki Izuku." The detective smiled. "Izuku? That's a nice name." Izuku shifted. He didn't seem to be crying anymore and just seemed nervous and uncomfortable. "My mom gave it to me." His voice was quiet, almost too quiet. Izuku stared at his feet. Night-Eye frowned before speaking. "That was a good birthday present." Izuku looked at him before a smile cracked onto his face and a small giggle came out of the toddler. A small growl sounded off, and the blush on the kid's face gave a hint at just whose stomach it was. Tsukachi stood up and walked into his office, and after a few minutes of silence he came back with a TV dinner and plastic fork. He held it out for Izuku, who stared at the food. "You need it more than I do, little guy." Who knew when this kid had last eaten? Night-Eye sat in one of the seats and watched the kid as the detective left to work on something. His thoughts turned to All Might, and if he had managed to find the boy's mother or not. ~~, a scream echoed through the alley as blood splattered. 𝐻𝐻𝐿's heart raced as she struggled to get 𝐀𝐻𝐬's foot off her chest. It was starting to dig into her skin, but that was nothing next to the pain that had spread across her left arm as it was ripped off. 𝐀𝐻𝐬 threw the limb off to the side and pressed his foot further into 𝐻𝐻𝐬's chest. He was very close to breaking her sternum. "Where is Izuku?" It wasn't a question. It was a demand. Hari was already out searching for Izuku. 𝐻𝐻𝐬 spat at him and took a moment to watch where it landed. The bumps that formed on his skin made it obvious that had been a bad idea. But 𝐻𝐻𝐬 couldn't bring herself to regret it. "He's as far from you as possible," 𝐻𝐻𝐬 spat the words. "You'll never see him ever again." 𝐀𝐻𝐬 pulled one of his gloves off and reached towards the woman's face. "You won't either." 𝐻𝐻𝐬 felt the fingers connect and closed her eyes. She had known how this would end, and she accepted it. "I'm sorry, Izuku." All Might squeezed through the thin alleyways into a larger one. He wished he had a flashlight to see better. He stepped into something sticky and looked down. He regretted it immediately. His shoe was in a puddle of blood. Looking around showed 2 more splatters. All Might resisted the urge to gag as the scent assaulted his nose. As he covered his nose, he saw a shimmer. He bent down to pick it up and saw that it was a golden locket. Flipping it open showed a picture. A green-haired woman holding a child who couldn't have been more than 2 years old. It was the kid from earlier. All Might's heart fell into his stomach. This must have belonged to the boy's mother, and the blood splatters were the only thing left of the woman. All Might began his journey to the police station with a heavy heart. The drizzle of rain that started didn't help his mood or thoughts. He couldn't save her. Night-Eye knelt in front of a desk as he tried to coax Izuku out from under it. A police officer had brought in a villain whose temper had terrified the poor child, sending him scurrying to take cover, bags and all. Fortunately, the desk in question was Nehemasa's, which made it less of an issue. Night-Eye didn't want to risk having to grab the toddler in case he panicked and used his quirk by accident. The door opened and Night-Eye looked over to see All Might stepping through. Alone. His expression wasn't promising. Hearing a squeak, Night-Eye looked back to the toddler to see him frozen stiff, wrapped up in Nehemasa's coat, as the detective slowly moved the boy out from under the desk and into his lap. The toddler was still not moving. "Detective, that may have been a bad idea. We don't know if he was abused or not." Night-Eye scolded the man as he took a second look at the toddler when he heard a mumble and froze. Almost hidden by the kid's jacket was a handprint-shaped purple bruise on his right cheek. Was that bruise always there? Nehemasa looked and nodded. "Thought you already noticed it. The kid was hiding it." Warm. Both adults looked at the toddler for that. All Might eventually finished giving his report to another officer and approached them. He held a closed heart-shaped locket out to the child. Do you know what this is? It's Mama's. She never took it off. Small hands clasped it tightly. All Might's brows furrowed. Did you find Mama? I'm sorry, buddy. This is all I could find, 𝐻𝐸 and 𝐻𝐸𝐬 paled. She's gone. I'm sorry. The adults watched the toddler's face as it clicked. Green and gold eyes filled with tears, and 𝐻𝐸𝐬 prepared for the impending wails of grief. But they never came. A second glance showed that the toddler was crying. Tears flowed down his cheeks, and his body shook as if racked by sobs. But not a single sound escaped him. 𝐻𝐸 paled as his suspicions returned fivefold. A child being that quiet usually pointed to an abusive or broken home. A place where the kids grew up knowing that making noise while crying was a bad idea, so they conditioned themselves to not make a sound. The detective handed 𝐬𝐸𝐬 over to 𝐻𝐸 as he motioned All Might into a different room with him. 𝐻𝐸 could guess they were going to discuss where the boy would go. Considering the circumstances, he supposed that sending the child into witness protection with a hero raising and watching him would be for the best. But he didn't think the kid would react well to being placed with a stranger. He heard the door open and glanced towards it. The detective looked weary as ever, but All Might seemed almost apprehensive. Sir 𝐻𝐸, the detective spoke. You wouldn't mind caring for the boy until he's old enough to care for himself, would you? You mean raise him? The detective coughed and nodded. 𝐻𝐸 looked down at the toddler in his arms and saw that the boy's tears had subsided, and he was fast asleep. He slowly unwrapped the brown jacket from the boy and handed the coat to the detective. 𝐻𝐸 decided he would use his quirk on 𝐬𝐸𝐬. He looked forward by an hour, a day, a week, a month, then a year. But before he could see further, he saw something that stopped him. Or rather someone. A young boy, possibly a member of the 𝐸𝐸𝐬 family, if the engines in his legs were any hint. He stood next to 𝐬𝐸𝐬. 𝐻𝐸 couldn't see any other details. And then, suddenly, both were taken by men in beak masks. The film became blurry after that point, and 𝐻𝐸 was forced to stop using his quirk. The boy would need a positive home to prevent that future. 𝐻𝐸's predictions had never been wrong. That lesson was engraved in his mind after the past 8 years. He still wanted to try and see if he could change it, one last time. I suppose I could. He stared at the child in his arms. All Might seemed to relax a bit and smiled lightly. 𝐻𝐸 rewrapped 𝐬𝐸𝐬 with his coat and picked up his bags. I'll file the paperwork and send you the forms you need to deal with tomorrow then. For now, I've scheduled an appointment for him with Recovery Girl later today. He needs a checkup, and I need to go home and get some sleep. 𝐬𝐸𝐬 spoke. 𝐻𝐸 nodded his acceptance. As he left the building, child in his arms, he felt the rain begin to soak him. He briskly walked to his car and opened the rear door. He settled the sleeping toddler safely into the back seat and stowed the bags next to him, before getting in himself and driving off. His new ward had an appointment with a doctor. 𝐷𝐷𝐻𝐸𝐬 slowly woke up to the familiar smell of cleaning supplies. Was it cleaning time? He looked around at the white room. The green-haired man, 𝐻𝐸 if 𝐬𝐸𝐬 recalled correctly, was in the room holding his bags. But there were also 2 new people. An old woman with a cane, dressed like a nurse, and a man with a white coat. He rubbed his eyes and sat up, gaining the adult's attention. The white-coated man smiled at him and turned to him. Hello, little one. Did you have a nice nap? You slept right through your checkup. We still need your height, weight, and an eye exam though, so will you help me with that? A hand was offered to 𝐬𝐸𝐬. 𝐬𝐸𝐬 stared at it before nodding and getting himself off of the chair he was on. The proffered hand retracted, and he was led to a scale and measuring chart. He did as he was told and stood still as the white-coated man did things to the scale. 𝐬𝐸𝐬 watched the 3 adults in the room. 𝐻𝐸 was watching him right back and seemed relieved when his weight and height were read out. He said something in a language 𝐬𝐸𝐬 couldn't quite understand, but that he'd heard before. His parents and grandfather had spoken it on occasion. Hari had told him that they did it for things they didn't want 𝐬𝐸𝐬 to hear, like planning a surprise for him. 𝐬𝐸𝐬 doubted that these people were discussing a surprise. He heard his name mentioned and realized they were talking about him. You know, it's rude to speak another language to talk about someone. The adults turned towards the small voice. They met green and gold eyes, tiny arms crossed across the chest, with a pout on his face. 𝐻𝐸𝐬 gave him a look of surprise and a chuckle slipped out. This kid was surprisingly smart. The old woman spoke next. And it's just as rude to interrupt when adults are talking. 𝐻𝐸 glanced at the woman. He saw her as she advanced and lightly kissed the toddler's forehead. He observed as the bruise on Izuku's cheek disappeared and frowned when hives formed on the boy's forehead, and he started scratching the area. Recovery Girl looked at the dog, sticking its head through an opening in the zipper that 𝐻𝐸 had left. She remembered him mentioning that the pup had a broken leg. As much as I wish I could help, I'm unsure if my quirk can safely work on animals. She held a dog treat out to the pup and watched it sniff at the treat before accepting it and retreating into the bag to scarf it down. And even then, who knows how much energy she has currently. I'll take her to a vet then. 𝐻𝐸 nodded. Recovery Girl made a noise of approval as she returned to assisting the doctor with Izuku's exam. 𝐻𝐸 watched as the checkup concluded and scheduled a follow-up appointment for necessary shots in 2 months. 𝐻𝐸 finished talking to the doctor and Recovery Girl as Izuku waited in the waiting room. Eventually, they were cleared to head home. The car ride was quiet, the only noise being the radio's soft music. 𝐻𝐸 was stopped at a red light, tapping his fingers on the wheel and mouthing the lyrics when he was surprised by a tiny voice that started singing along. He glanced back and sat the toddler looking out the window while he was singing along with the lyrics. 𝐻𝐸 felt a bit of relief. He really didn't like it when the kid was quiet. 𝐻𝐸 suddenly blanked. He realized he had been internally referring to the toddler as the kid constantly despite knowing his name. He glanced back one last time as he spoke up. Hey, Chisaki. The kid's eyes flicked over to look at 𝐻𝐸. But otherwise, he stayed still. Do you want me to call you anything specific? A look of confusion passed over the boy's face, and he responded with a low mumble that 𝐻𝐸 barely caught. Hari always called me Izu-kun. Mimic called me Little Boss. Izu-kun seemed like a good name for now. He'd have to ask who Hari and Mimic were later. Izu-kun? Yes, 𝐻𝐸 snorted. No, I meant, could I call you Izu-kun? A small O followed before a reply. Yes. The rest of the drive was quiet. Eventually, 𝐻𝐸 turned into his apartment complex. It was still raining, so, as he removed his keys from the ignition, he grabbed the umbrella he stored inside the car and opened the door, and then Izuku's. Izuku grabbed his bags and hopped out of the car, right into a puddle. The toddler stared at his soaked shoes and giggled while stomping a foot down, only to get a yelp of surprise as the splash hit 𝐻𝐸. He looked at the man and shyly giggled. 𝐻𝐸 didn't look angry. At least you're having fun. Izuku beamed and followed the man inside the building. It was smaller than the home Izuku knew. He looked around after taking his shoes off by the door. 𝐻𝐸 watched Izuku for a moment, and then opened a drawer and pulled out a first aid kit. He looked around before frowning. He grabbed a pair of chopsticks to use as a splint and ambled over to the couch and gently took the animal out of its pack. Izuku followed and watched 𝐻𝐸 take the 2 pieces of wood and lay them near the dog's broken leg. As he opened up the kit, he spoke. Do they have a name? Name, Izuku thought. His father didn't say that it had a name. Do they not have a name? The toddler shook his head. No. 𝐻𝐸 hummed and took out the medical tape. You can make one for? He lifted her tail and took a look under it. Her. He dropped the tail and went to splint the broken leg. Izuku began to think. The pup was golden like butter, and looked as if she had her legs and belly dripped in chocolate. She looks like butter in a cup, so Buttercup. Those flowers are in bloom at this time of year. 𝐻𝐸 remembered that from a flower hero he had met a few years back. He suddenly had a bad taste in his mouth. He shook a resurfacing memory and finished splinting the leg. Izuku looked amazed as he watched 𝐻𝐸 work. 𝐻𝐸 stood up and walked to the kitchen. It was nearly an hour till midnight. He looked towards the wide-awake toddler talking to the pup. He hoped some food would knock him out for the rest of the night. Izuku laughed as Buttercup licked his face. Soon enough, she settled down and laid her head down to sleep. Izuku decided to take a look around. There was a small balcony outside. He walked to the glass sliding door leading to it and looked at the night sky. Dark clouds continued to pour rain onto the earth below. To the right was a kitchen. The smells of food being cooked slowly filled the open space. Looking left, he saw a TV and disc player. It wasn't as big as the one back home, but he didn't really care. He had never really been allowed to watch it anyway. Dad always told him it would ruin his eyesight. Izuku continued to explore the open space. There was a table in the corner with a computer on it, the chair pushed in. Hari had shown him funny videos and pictures on one before. He couldn't remember what they were called. Meanwhile, 𝐻𝐸 finished the food and set the table, thankful that he had 2 chairs. He filled 2 bowls plus another partial bowl and brought them over. 𝐬𝐸-kun. It felt strange to say that. He'd have to think of a new way to get the kids' attention. Time to eat. Have you had udon before? The boy shook his head as he walked over and sat down in a chair. 𝐻𝐸 set the 2 filled bowls down on the table and the partially filled one on the floor. He walked over to the couch and gently picked up 𝗵𝗃𝗃 before lightly setting her down in front of the small bowl. As soon as she realized she was being fed, she dug in. 𝐻𝐸 sat down and began eating, 𝐬𝐸 having already started. Mister? 𝐻𝐸 looked up at 𝐬𝐸. What's your name? That's right. The kid had no way to call him anything other than 𝐻𝐸, and if he was going to be fostering him, he might as well know his family name. Sasaki. 𝐬𝐸 tested the name out and took a few tries to get it right. Is it all right if I call you 𝐬𝐸 or 𝐬𝐸? 𝐬𝐸 looked up, thought, then nodded. They both went back to eating their meal in silence. Once the dishes were in the sink, yawns broke out from both of them. Sasaki chuckled and turned to the toddler. Tired? After seeing a small nod, Sasaki picked 𝐬𝐸 up, mentally noting the small 5-second tense that faded as he carried the toddler to his room. Sasaki lived alone, so he had a 1-bedroom apartment. Not too big, not too small. The kid could use the bed, he decided, and he could crash on the couch until they either moved to a 2-bedroom apartment or got a kid's-sized bed. You can use my bed. I have a few more things to do before sleeping, but you need to rest. 𝐬𝐸 was already half asleep when the covers were laid over him. Something wet tapped on Sasaki's ankle, and he looked down to see 𝗵𝗃𝗃. After a small smirk, he picked the pup up and laid her next to the toddler. Thank you. Good night, Mr. Sasaki. A small arm laid over the small golden mass of fur. Good night, 𝐬𝐸. Sasaki closed the door and went to his laptop. He began to search up a few things. 𝐬𝐸 would need a therapist for dealing with his mother's death. Sasaki was certain that the boy had not fully processed his new circumstances. Luckily, one was easy to find and set up an appointment for. So he moved on to the next thing. Quirk suppressants for any possible night terrors or hidden trauma. He took the weight the doctor told him and ordered 2 types. Pills and needle. The needle was instant and would only be used for emergencies. Pills were for if he felt unsafe, or as if he couldn't control it. 𝐻𝐸 made a mental note to find out what the 𝐬𝐸's quirk was before giving him any suppressants. Just in case. If it wasn't a dangerous quirk, he could give the suppressants to the neighbors. He knew their son was having quirk troubles, and they couldn't always afford the price of the pills. Sasaki moved on to his next topic. What 𝗵𝗃𝗃 would need to do in order to become an emotional support animal. Once he got the price and details for the training, he opened one last tab and looked up one last thing. Eventually, he started to flag from the long day. So he turned off the computer screen and moved to grab an extra blanket and pillow he had. He fell asleep almost as soon as he laid down on the couch. 𝗳𝗲𝗃 Sasaki wasn't sure how long he had been asleep for before a blinding light was shone in his eyes. He tried to block it out, but decided he was already up. He sat up and reached his arms up as he stretched. He stood up and made his way to the kitchen to cook a nice breakfast when he heard the sound of bare feet on wood. He looked down at the floor and saw 𝐬𝐸 rubbing his eyes at the entrance of the hallway, 𝗵𝗃𝗃 hopping after him. You're loud. Sasaki raised a brow. He had barely made any noise. Was the kid a light sleeper? Well, I'm making breakfast. So go ahead and sit at the table. Sasaki turned back to what he was cooking. Shouldn't I take a shower first? That question threw Sasaki off. His eyes flickered to 𝐬𝐸 as the boy stared at him. From what he knew from Heroes with Kids, kids hated baths, let alone showers. You can take one after you eat. Sasaki's voice was a bit unsure. Dad always made me take one before coming out of my room, but I usually had Hari's help. Sasaki watched the toddler sit down. The bathroom was in the hallway, so it's likely that the kid was partially asking where the bathroom was. If 𝐬𝐸's father made him a shower every morning, it seemed likely that he must suffer from a type of germophobia, and may have forced it onto 𝐬𝐸. It somewhat explained the tense reaction to being touched that he had displayed last night. So what's your quirk? Sasaki watched the boy's eyes light up, and he mentally noted that 𝐬𝐸 seemed to like quirks. I have both my mama and dad's quirks. Sasaki cleaned 2 of the bowls from last night and dried them with a towel as he listened. Dad said it's called Overhaul on his end and Small Object Attraction on Mama's end. So the kid was a Quirk chimera. 2 in 1. Small Object Attraction was self-explaining. It sounded like it could be slightly dangerous, but was probably easy to train and control. Overhaul, however, needed explaining. What all does Overhaul do? He poured the soup-like meal into the clean bowls. Overhaul can take apart and remake anything I touch with just a finger. Both objects and living things. Izuku trailed off as he looked at Buttercup and held his cheek. Sasaki frowned slightly, placing the bowl on the table. The quirk was deadly, but this was more important. He also had a theory he wanted to test. Do you know why your father hit you? The toddler turned to him. He looked away for a second before nodding. I was misbehaving and not listening. The adult's frown deepened as his suspicions were confirmed. So it was his father who had hit him. It also meant it was likely that the father had killed the mother. That confirmed that it would be best for Izuku to be staying with a hero. That's not a good reason to smack you hard enough to bruise. Sasaki sat in his chair. When can I go home? Izuku asked before taking a bite of the food. Sasaki nearly choked as the question brought him up short. After taking a moment to clear his throat, he asked, What do you mean? This kid couldn't possibly want to go back to his home. Not if his father had killed his mother, hit him, and who knows what else. To my dad, Hari, Grandpa, Mimic, the new guy, and Mama. Sasaki supposed that his mother's death hadn't sunk in yet. He probably thinks she's back home. Or maybe he was just in denial, Night mused. It occurred to him then that All Might hadn't been fully explicit when he had reported her death. It was obvious to him. But Izuku must have rationalized that All Might meant that she was only missing, or had been taken back home. Sasaki stopped himself short. He didn't want to pull the rug out from under the kid and cause him to possibly try and bolt back to an abusive home, or worse. This, he decided, was a conversation topic best left to a different sort of professional. He was thankful that he'd had the foresight to schedule an appointment. I'm afraid that I don't know. Izuku paused, but seemed to accept the answer and nodded. He sighed in forlorn acceptance and mumbled to himself, though loudly enough that Sasaki could understand. I hope I get to go back someday. Sasaki sat in the vet's waiting room reading a magazine with Izuku. They had brought Buttercup in to get her leg checked, and they had gotten her a general checkup and her needed shots while they were there. Izuku's hair still remained damp from his bath that morning. Sasaki had helped him as much as he could. He had found it a bit awkward to help a 4-year-old clean up. He also learned just how germophobic Izuku's father was, having taught his son that he needed to scrub his arms red in order for it to be clean. Luckily, it was a behavior that could easily be curbed. Sasaki Murai. Sasaki looked up at his full name. Buttercup is all ready to head home. Izuku seemed ecstatic as they both stood up and walked with the vet to the back. When they saw her, Buttercup had a blue cast on her broken leg. The vet ushered Murai over to show him an X-ray of the break, while Izuku reunited with the puppy. It was a clean break, as if someone had purposefully broken it. His mood darkened for a moment until he looked at Izuku and Buttercup. Buttercup was in her carrier, which had wheels on the bottom, riding along as Izuku wheeled her around. Both seemed as happy as can be. Murai let out a small smile at their antics, and then moved to pay the vet's bill. They still had more shopping to do today, and the adult couldn't be happier that he'd gotten the day off to do this. Kai huffed in frustration as he sat behind his desk. The computer screen was blank and showed the set background of the Yakuza's symbol. There had been no leads on Izuku's location besides Hari, having seen the hero Sir Night and the number 1 hero take Izuku. He hadn't been able to see where they went as All Might moved into the alleyway. Well, 𝐀𝐦 was no longer a problem anymore. He had made sure of that. Though it did mean that once Izuku was found and returned, Hari would become the single person tasked with raising Izuku. He was sure Hari wouldn't mind, given that he had already done so with 𝐀𝐦 before she betrayed the family. Hikoichi had seemed a bit sad about the whole thing and was sulking. Kai had felt a bit upset about lying to his father, but he at least had told half the truth. He needed his successor back before he was poisoned by the hero's disease. Murai sat in another waiting room. He tried to make himself look casual, but the kids in the room had recognized him. Luckily, the staff didn't seem to mind. In fact, they had seemed glad. He supposed the kids being excited was a good thing. It was certainly better than them being sad. He was currently texting with All Might. having gotten the hero's number when the man had sent him a link to Izuku's case file. Eventually, he saw one text that got him excited, as much as he tried to hide it. All Might. All right, fine. I'll hire you as a sidekick. Geez, you're persistent. At that point, Izuku, known to the therapist's office under the name Araki Ryoso, stepped out of the office hallway. Mirai pocketed his phone and stood to greet him and the therapist, who returned Mirai's greetings with a sad smile. As he looked at Izuku, he couldn't suppress a flinch at how dead and lifeless the boy seemed compared to earlier. His eyes were cast downward and lacked the light they had held before. It seems like he learned the truth about what happened to his mother, Mirai thought regretfully. He didn't think he'd have done it like that, but he supposed that ripping off the band-aid was probably the best approach. He nodded to the other man and quietly stepped over to the receptionist to make another appointment. All right, Araki-kun, I'll see you in a month. The therapist confirmed with another sad smile as he patted the boy's shoulder. Izuku simply nodded and reached over to grab Mirai's pants leg. Mirai reached down and picked the boy up. He saw the dry tear trails down his cheeks and rubbed the boy's back comfortingly. They finished saying their goodbyes to the therapist and began making their way out to the car. Once they left the building, Izuku spoke quietly. So she's gone. Mirai nodded. I'm sorry, Izuku-kun. No one should go through this. Especially not someone your age. Mirai sat Izuku in the back seat and drove to a fast food restaurant. They still needed dinner, and he wanted to calm Izuku down by getting home as quickly as possible. In the 2 months since that day, Izuku had moved well onto the second stage of grief, anger. It was a rare day that he wouldn't see the boy seething in anger at some point. He had been especially angry when Mirai told him that Buttercup needed to be taken to a special kennel in order for her to train to become a service dog for him. Currently, Izuku and 𝐻𝐻𝐸 were at All Might's agency. 𝐻𝐻𝐸 had brought the boy to work with him for lack of a better option, and he was just finishing up some paperwork when All Might peeked in with a stack of paper. Izuku was sitting in a chair and reading a book, barely even looking up at the interruption as he stared at the book with a sour look on his face. All Might apologized as he placed the stack of papers on 𝐻𝐻𝐸's desk. Mirai raised a brow and didn't say a word. The blonde turned towards Izuku with his signature grin. Hello, young Kai, it's Araki now. Izuku's interruption was quick and simple. All Might faltered for a second. Ah, I see. My apologies. The room became silent other than 𝐻𝐻𝐸 writing away on the reports. There's not a lot of people here, Izuku asked. Why is that? All Might wasn't sure how to respond to that. He had never really felt like hiring sidekicks, and he had only hired 𝐻𝐻𝐸 because the man had bugged him until he gave in. Plus, who knew if All for One would try to insert spies into his agency? I'm not sure, young Araki. Izuku looked up with a bored look. He just stared before turning back to his book. All Might frowned and walked over to Izuku, reaching out to give him a pat on the head, only to hear 𝐻𝐻𝐸 shout. Don't. All Might's hand halted and Izuku looked up. A look of fear shot across the 5-year-old's face and quickly retreated behind 𝐻𝐻𝐸, who turned in his chair with a sigh. He scooped the toddler up into his arms and whispered a question to the boy, who shook his head no in response. All Might frowned. He wasn't used to children being afraid of him. Young Araki, you know I won't hurt you, Rig. His father smacked him, remember? You had a hand near his face. He panicked. 𝐻𝐻𝐸's English was quick and to the point. He was rubbing the toddler's back. All Might realized his mistake, but he still wanted the boy to know he wouldn't hurt him. He was the symbol of peace after all. He wouldn't dare hurt a child. He walked over and knelt down by 𝐻𝐻𝐸's desk. Gold and green eyes stared at him, waiting for any movement. Young Araki, do you who I am? Both adults froze as Izuku shook his head. It was extremely uncommon for a person to not know about All Might, and that spoke volumes. 𝐻𝐻𝐸 found his voice first. Why don't you know him? He's All Might. Izuku tilted his head, gave a shrug before looking up. His eyes gave the light of confusion and worry. It was the worry of someone who thought they were about to be punished. Am I supposed to know him? 𝐻𝐻𝐸 sighed. If Izuku didn't know All Might, it's likely he knew nothing about hero. He knew that children that were saved from a villain parent or parents often didn't know or trust heroes. It was usually to keep the idea of becoming a hero out of the kids' heads and to keep them in the family business. That led him to believe that Izuku's father was probably an established villain, even ignoring the murder, child abuse, and animal abuse. It's normal for kids to know them, But it's fine if you don't. You can learn. 𝐻𝐸 gave 𝐬𝐸 a small smirk. The green-haired toddler smiled right back, hugging 𝐻𝐸 tightly. If All Might didn't know better, he'd say they looked like father and son. ~~ All Might. No, Yagi Toshinori was tired. All Might didn't get tired. The blonde looked towards 𝐻𝐸's office and saw the man stepping out carrying 𝐬𝐸, who had his head resting on the man's shoulder. The kid was asleep. Yagi walked over and scooped the 5-year-old up, much to Murai's surprise. Thought I would help, a low whisper came. Murai gave a nod and got the rest of his stuff to his car, while Yagi placed 𝐬𝐸 in the back seat. The boy was still asleep as he was strapped in. Yagi took a step back. Sorry for all the paperwork. It was a busy day. Just means you do your job well. Murai thought it had been a good day. He managed to finish his work, learned something new about 𝐬𝐸, and now knew how long the kid could stay up for. After saying goodbye, Murai sat in his car and began the drive home. As he drove, it began to rain. They had been getting a lot of it this year. Once Murai got back to their home, he laid the toddler down on the couch and went to turn up the heater. Then he walked to the kitchen and began preparing dinner for the both of them. He had just put in the soba noodles, and when a loud crack of thunder sounded through the apartment. A scream followed soon after. Murai's head jerked over to look at 𝐬𝐸, and saw the lines that indicated 𝐬𝐸's quirk spreading across the couch. Damn, he thought. He quickly grabbed one of the quirk suppressants and ran towards the kid. 𝐬𝐸 was so terrified that he barely noticed when the needle entered his arm. After a few seconds the lines disappeared and Murai put the needle aside and scooped the boy up into his arms. 𝐬𝐸 latched on to Murai's shirt as the man disposed of the empty vial and moved to finish their dinner. The boy was crying against his chest, still as silent as ever. Murai poured 2 bowls as he finished and moved them into the living room. He set the bowls on the coffee table, sat on the couch, and comforted the shivering child in his arms. Murai set a flashlight out on the table as 𝐬𝐸 finished eating his soba. The storm was still raging outside and the power had gone out. Murai sat next to 𝐬𝐸 and began to eat his own meal. Hari always liked watching the rain. 𝐬𝐸's voice was quiet and seemed slightly reminiscent. 𝐻𝐸 remembered hearing the name on occasion. Who's Hari? I've heard you say his name before. 𝐬𝐸 looked up. He seemed to smile a bit. My godfather. He was friends with Mama and Dad. Murai nodded. So Hari was a family friend, and he was close enough to be given the title of godfather to 𝐬𝐸. Do you want to talk about him? That was the right thing to say as 𝐬𝐸 smiled brightly and took a drink of water. The night was filled with talking as the storm raged on in the background. Murai woke up the next morning with a stiff back and a weight on his chest. He looked down to see 𝐬𝐸 laying on him, sound asleep. He held back a small chuckle at the toddler as he slowly lifted 𝐬𝐸 up and carried him to the bed he had bought for him. Carefully laying the toddler down in the bed and covering him with the blankets, Murai felt as if he was handling an explosive instead of a 5-year-old. Once 𝐬𝐸 was tucked into his bed, Murai closed the door to 𝐬𝐸's room and went to the living room. He started a cup of coffee and took a look at the calendar. Written in red ink was 𝐬𝐸's first day at daycare. That's right, 𝐬𝐸 was joining the neighborhood daycare today. He had talked with the teachers, and they had happily agreed to take 𝐬𝐸 in, despite him being a bit behind. Murai went down his mental to-do list for the day. The main thing was to get 𝐬𝐸 ready for school. He grabbed the daycare uniform and laid it out in 𝐬𝐸's room. He looked at the alarm clock on the nightstand and noticed that it was almost time, so he left to the kitchen. He grabbed the coffee pot and poured himself a cup, adding in flavor shots as he thought of what to make for breakfast. Right on cue, an alarm sounded, and a few moments later Murai heard the shower running as 𝐬𝐸 began to get ready. Good, one less thing he had to do. After deciding on a simple Western-style breakfast of eggs, bacon, and toast, Murai set to work cooking. As he did, he mentally prepared himself for his day, briefly checking his own schedule. He finished cooking, set the food on plates, and, noticing the shower was still running, took a few minutes to pack 𝐬𝐸's bag. He grabbed some of 𝐬𝐸's quirk suppressants, made sure their caps were on, and placed them in the boy's travel bag with a note. The note was just instructions for what to do after school. Murai knew it would be a good spot to put it. 𝐬𝐸 most likely would see it quickly if his fear of his own quirk was anything to go off of. He made a mental note to make sure that the boy's therapist knew about that. The shower turned off and 2 doors opened and closed in the hallway. 𝐬𝐸 was out of the shower and getting dressed. Murai looked at the clock and continued with his mental preparations. A noise startled him out of his musings a few minutes later. He looked behind him to see Izuku dressed in his daycare uniform, eating the breakfast that had been set out. Murai took a quick glance at the clock and moved to join Izuku at the table, eating his own breakfast, and then going to take a shower of his own. After he was dressed and Izuku finished, Murai took a comb to the wild curls on the boy's head and did his best to tidy it up while it was still damp. The curls claimed a victim the last time he tried to brush it dry. It still held its natural curls after he was done, but it was more tame and didn't stick out every which way. After they both checked that they had everything, they rushed to the car and got in. Izuku watched as kids his age ran into the building Sasaki had stopped in front of. He knew he was starting school, but now he was worried. What if he couldn't make any friends? What if he got sick? What if he hurt someone? A paper brushed his cheek, and the 5-year-old moved slightly in response. He looked at the paper and saw writing. He read it and looked up at Sasaki, who was getting him out of the car. "Give this to your teacher. It's about your suppressants." Izuku nodded and grabbed the note, allowing Sasaki to scoop him up and place him outside the car. "And remember," Sasaki knelt in front of the toddler, "you are Araki Ryoso, not Chisaki Izuku." Izuku nodded and hugged Sasaki, who flinched a little at the sudden hug, but quickly hugged back. When Izuku looked up, he saw a small smile, and it caused him to smile big. Maybe this day wouldn't be so bad. And this is Araki Ryoso. He's a new student joining us from now on. Izuku looked up at teacher. She didn't look different from most people other than the doe ears on her head. He also has a very strong quirk. That caused Izuku to frown. She didn't need to say that last part. She finished talking, and he sat down. His classmates stared at him for a bit before they went back to listening to the teacher. Izuku found himself wishing that Buttercup was there with him. The day went by quickly, and as soon as a break was announced, his seat was swarmed and Izuku bolted to a wall to at least not have a blind spot. He didn't like large groups, and never had. The other kids began asking about his quirk, what it did, and how it worked. He kept silent. A blonde pushed himself to the front and stood in front of the other kids with a scowl and his arms crossed. His hair was spiked like a hedgehog, red eyes glaring at him, but Izuku could have sworn he had seen the boy before. "Why are you circled around a nobody?" Izuku looked at the blonde. "Oh, it's the new kid. He's refusing to use his quirk," a boy with red wings spoke. "I think he's just lying and doesn't actually have one." Izuku didn't quite see the problem with not showing them his quirk or not having one. His father had told him that being quirkless was better than having a quirk. Sasaki had told him quirks weren't everything about a person, and that you shouldn't assume things about a person based off their quirk. "Hey, new kid, are you going to show us your quirk or what?" Izuku watched the boy's eyes alight almost playfully when he raised one palm to face skyward. Without warning, a blast of heat burned his face and brought moisture to his eyes, as they were dried by the small explosion that erupted from the blonde's hand. Izuku jolted back at the noise and threat. Was this kid serious? Was a quirk really that big of a deal? "No, I'm not going to use it," Izuku shouted, hoping the teacher, while Izuku's thought process was cut short as he felt hands on his chest. Someone had touched him. Someone touched him. His hands flew back as the ground suddenly became slippery, and he felt his quirk go off. The wooden floor became softer before he landed, and then it spiked up behind him, creating a sort of chair back made out of wooden spikes. The other students backed up before yelling about how strong his quirk was while the blonde stayed silent. Izuku didn't care as he began scratching the areas he was touched, trying to get the new dirt and germs off of his clean clothes. The other kids' yelling fell on deaf ears as Bakugo Katsuki stared at the new kid. The kid who just changed the floor just by touching it. The teacher wasn't lying about him having a strong quirk. A quirk stronger than his own. This kid was going to overshadow him if he didn't do anything. That's when he noticed the hives on the new kid, along with how he was scratching himself. "You get bumps just from being touched?" Izuku looked up as he scratched. "What kind of freak are you?" The other kids quickly joined in. Names, insults, you name it, quickly made their way to Izuku, and the green-haired boy just went silent, wanting the day to be over. Murray wasn't in his suit when he picked Izuku up. It needed repairs from a minor villain earlier in the day who had managed to get in a lucky hit, so he was just wearing a shirt and pants. It worked in his favor as the kids leaving the daycare didn't recognize or really even notice him. He eventually saw 𝐬𝐻𝐻, who trudged over sluggishly. Mirai assumed it was from the environment and routine change, that it would fade in the next month. He helped 𝐬𝐻𝐻 into the car and drove home. 𝐬𝐻𝐻 stared out the window as he drove, something that was common for the boy. When they got home, both were tired, so, after a quick dinner, they quickly went to their own rooms and promptly passed out in their beds. As 𝐬𝐻𝐻 stirred from his sleep, he looked around his bedroom before standing up and stretching. The house was quiet and dark, he noted, but still warm. He ambled out of his room, looked into the living room and kitchen, and saw both empty. The clock showed that it was around the time dinner was usually done. He walked to Sasaki's room and knocked. Mirai opened the door after a bit, missing his glasses. He squinted at the clock behind 𝐬𝐻𝐻 and went back to get his glasses. 𝐬𝐻𝐻 had wanted to tell him about his school day. He really did, but his stomach chose that moment to make it very clear that he was hungry. He could tell Sasaki while eating. He didn't want to go back to the school, back to the students who hurt him. He watched Sasaki order takeout as the man woke up. He also didn't want the man to stress out over him either. Mori came over to 𝐬𝐻𝐻 and ruffled the boy's hair. "Thank you for waking me up." 𝐬𝐻𝐻 smiled and nodded brightly, following his caretaker to the living room. He could tell Sasaki later. Soon the takeout arrived, and they are while watching a show about heroes and their jobs, Sasaki giving his own commentary. 𝐬𝐻𝐻 was lost in his own thoughts. He had told Sasaki about his family, but had never met, or even heard of Sasaki's family. He looked up to the man and used a hand to tug on his shirt. Once he had the man's attention, he spoke. "What's your family like?" Mirai turned away and took a breath. "I don't talk or see them often." 𝐬𝐻𝐻 looked up at Mirai as he spoke. "Mom works nights as a nurse, and my brother is still a student. Our schedules don't mesh often, and when they do, either me or Mom get called in for something." "What about your dad?" 𝐬𝐻𝐻 saw Mirai let out a shaky breath before speaking. "He passed away when I was starting at UA. Was caught in a villain attack." Mirai felt small arms wrap around him and a face pressed into his hip. He looked towards it and smiled before picking 𝐬𝐻𝐻 up to hug back. He was glad that the kid felt comfortable enough to hug him without being prompted. He returned the hug tightly, not really wanting to let go. They stayed in silence the rest of the night. __. It was nice watching as 𝐬𝐻𝐻 became more lively after a few more months of therapy. He wasn't fully done mourning, but it was calmer. One morning, Mirai woke up shivering. He got out of bed and went to turn the heat on, and looked out the window to be met with a sea of white. It had snowed. That was surprising. He supposed he'd have to get some supplies. The daycare wasn't open today due to a villain attack that had been a little too close for comfort, and 𝐬𝐻𝐻 didn't have any sort of snow gear. Mirai got dressed in his snow clothes to make a quick shopping trip. As he arrived at the nearby mall, he saw a snowboarding shop and hummed in thought. __. Woke up at noon that day. Mirai wasn't home, so 𝐬𝐻𝐻 assumed he was at work. Mirai didn't leave him home alone often nowadays. The first few days, it had happened on occasion before Mirai came running back inside. He heard the door open and looked over from his spot on the floor by the coffee table. A halfway finished puzzle laid about. Mirai walked in with bags and in thick clothes. Snow had settled on his head and shoulders. 𝐬𝐻𝐻 let out a giggle at the sight before walking over. He watched Mirai kneel down and show what was in the bag. It was a blue jacket similar to the one Sasaki was wearing but smaller. There was snow pants, a hat, gloves, and a scarf. A box was on the bottom with shoes in it. 𝐬𝐻𝐻 looked up at Sasaki with confusion. The man chuckled. "Because it's snowing. You'll need these when we go outside today." 𝐬𝐻𝐻 perked up in excitement. He had only ever heard of snow before. Sasaki helped the 5-year-old get the snow clothes on and opened the front door. The boy immediately ran out to see what snow felt like. Mirai turned his back for 5 seconds to lock the door. It had been just long enough for 𝐬𝐻𝐻 to bury his front half in a snowbank. Mirai almost felt bad for breaking into a laugh as he pulled the boy free. Luckily 𝐬𝐻𝐻 was laughing too. __. Looked around the snowboard shop. There was so many boards along the wall, in the racks, hanging on the wall, each having its own design on it. Mirai was walking around with him and told him to pick his favorite design. Eventually, he stopped at one. On the top was an eclipse with a wolf jumping out of it into a pond. The wolf's reflection on the pond had glowing green eyes. 𝐬𝐻𝐻 stared at the design. Mirai was looking above him at the price. After a few more minutes searching, Mirai found a ski design he liked for himself. The two spent some time getting fitted for their board and skis. Izuku's design had been shrunk down to fit his now much smaller board. After buying both items and the gear, Murray carried the items to the car and put them in the trunk. Izuku buckled himself in the back seat and watched as they began to go somewhere. He was looking out the window as Murray drove. The car stopped at a building in the mountains, and Izuku saw people riding snowboards down the mountain. Murray chuckled as Izuku ran around in the snow, as he signed the two of them up for snowboarding and skiing lessons, using the fake name he always used when Izuku needed a name written somewhere. He then joined Izuku outside and got the boy suited up for lessons before getting ready himself, not hearing or seeing the conversation behind them. __ Sakaki, why are you doing? 𝐸𝐴 glared at the raven-haired man in the ski resort's beer garden. The man was mid-chug of a bottle of alcohol. He stopped and stared at Shin. I'm getting drunk. He immediately started drinking again. We have work to do, Shin explained. Overhaul had sent them here to place some bets for one of the snowboarding contests. Unfortunately, before he could complete his task, Sakaki had found the bar. We have time. I don't need you. Shin stopped as a familiar head of green curls came into view, and he looked at it before his heart missed a beat in shock. Overhaul's son was here, and he was getting a snowboarding lesson by the looks of it. Holy shit. That got Sakaki out of the bottle. What? That's Overhaul-sama's kid. He's here. Shin pointed at Izuku. He heard the trainer mention the name Araki, and the boy responded with a smile. Sakaki looked over. Let's grab him then. Shin had a similar idea, but stopped when All Might's sidekick, of all people, appeared from somewhere and helped Izuku out of his gear and taking the board off. The sidekick loaded their items into a car as Izuku excitedly ran around in the snow. There's a hero near him. We can't. Shin instead picked up his phone and texted their boss about his findings. Izuku being with a hero, him being called Araki, and where he was. The response he got made him float with pride. He knew his master wasn't one to praise, but the reply he got was as close to praise as he had ever seen. Overhaul, keep an eye on him. Shin decided to watch the child of his master from the corner of his eye to follow the order. __. Murray enjoyed Izuku's laughter as they walked around the city. It was his day off, but the ski resort was closed for the day, so he decided a walk to get the blood flowing was good. Izuku was currently walking on a short stone wall with his arms out for balance. When it came to an end, he hopped off and grabbed his caretaker's hand. Murray felt content. He wasn't sure why. Maybe it was winter nipping at his nose, fingertips, and ears. Maybe it was the tiny hand holding his fingers. Maybe it was both. He wasn't sure. He was pulled from his thoughts when Izuku tugged on his hand. He looked down at the toddler and gave his attention. Izuku pointed behind him at a park. Can we go there? Murray looked up and thought for a moment before nodding and walking with Izuku into the park. He watched as Izuku played in the snow. He knew Izuku was sheltered and wanted him not to be, so he tried to take the boy anywhere he could. He wanted to feed the boy's hunger for knowledge and to show him a world he was missing out on. He frowned when Izuku was hit with a snowball. Izuku shook his head and tried to continue playing, but more snowballs hit him and the scratching began. Murray was quick to walk over, reaching for the sanitary wipes in his bag. He was wiping the area when a sharp pain hit his arm. He looked and saw a rock in a snowball. He looked towards the kid who threw it and saw a spiky blonde-haired toddler with two others holding snowballs. His hands were full keeping Izuku from scratching and wiping the areas that were breaking out. Murray soon was done and picked up the 5-year-old, and another snowball hit him, this time on the back. He looked toward the source and saw the kids again, so he put Izuku down, made a snowball and chucked it at the 3. It hit its mark, the tree right behind the 3 boys. 2 of the kids scattered while the blonde looked at the white mark on the tree in shock. Murray picked Izuku back up and walked out of the park. __ Murray sat on a park bench in a different area. The park had a few other kids in it, but none were throwing snowballs at each other. He was currently watching Izuku make animals out of snow. Someone sat next to him, and the two didn't exchange words until they looked at each other. Hello, Ingenium, Murray spoke quietly, not wanting attention. The Ida smiled. Hello, Sir Nightai. With that the adults began talking. Izuku was having fun. He used his quirk a little to help the snow animals he made stay together. He then heard a loud thud followed by a thump. He looked over and saw someone's feet sticking out of a pile of snow by a tree. Izuku let out a giggle before unburying the kid. He was meat with dark blue hair and blue eyes. He noticed a pair of broken glasses by the tree and used Overhaul to fix them. He handed the fixed glasses to the boy, who put them on. Thanks, the blue-haired boy smiled and sat up. I'm 𝐴𝐻𝐻𝐬. What's your name? Izuku looked towards Mirai and saw him talking with someone who looked like 𝐻𝐻𝐬, so it probably wouldn't hurt to give his actual name. Chisaki Izuku. Izuku looked at the engines in the other boy's calves. Is that part of your quirk? He pointed at them. 𝐻𝐻𝐬 nodded with a smile. They are. This made the boy make robotic movements with his arms. They let me run fast, but I have to learn speed and control. They came in only a year ago. Izuku smiled. What's your quirk? Izuku focused on 𝐻𝐻𝐬's glasses and pulled. Soon enough the eyewear was in his open palm. He gave them back and placed his bare hands in the snow. He made a small army of 3-inch tall snowmen. 𝐻𝐻𝐬 looked at the army in awe. So you have two. My mamas and dads. Izuku smiled. He looked towards Mirai and got an idea. He relayed it to 𝐻𝐻𝐬, who smiled as they began their plan. Mirai and Tensei were talking when they both got pelted by several snowballs. Both heroes let out screams of surprise. Mirai saw nothing but white after the snowball attack, his entire face cold and wet. He pulled his glasses off to clean them as he heard the older Eddie yell. Okay, this is war. The two kids screamed playfully as the battle moved to the side. Mirai observed the blurry battle unfold while cleaning his glasses. His breath hitched when a familiar kid-sized blur spurred his memory into gear. It was the young Ida from Izuku's future. Putting his glasses back on, Mirai whipped his head around to try and see if the black car that he had also seen was present, only to be hit in the face by another snowball. Again, really? He heard 𝐀𝐦 laughing as he apologized. Sorry, overshot. Mirai shook his head fondly. It was worth it to see the kids having so much fun. They continued until they were wheezing in the snow. 𝗳𝗲𝗃 in the aftermath of the snowball fight. Mirai opened his front door with some difficulty as he carried a barely awake Izuku. Both kids had tired each other out before lunch, and 𝐀𝐦 had given Mirai his number so the kids could have more fun together. He sat Izuku on the floor and helped the green-haired boy out of his snow clothes. He paused for a moment as he was waiting for Izuku to pull off his snowshoes. He debated using his quirk to see if he had changed it at all. Eventually, the worry ate away at Mirai's reluctance, and, as he tucked Izuku in for a nap, he used his quirk once more. As he closed the door, he began looking through the future. Nothing looked too far out of the ordinary for the next 6 months or so. But then the vision showed the black car and people with beak masks. He frowned as Izuku was taken to his old room and family. He slid down Izuku's door in sorrow. He hadn't been able to change it. Hands began to grip green and yellow hair. Mori spent a few minutes sitting outside Izuku's room door, debating his next actions. He should have realized that he couldn't change Izuku's future. He never could change anyone's future. Even if he told them what would happen. Even if they died or lost limbs, or were captured and tortured or starved to death by the enemy. They always followed their path and died those ways. He put his face in his hands. Now he had to deal with a toddler who he'll lost now. Mori sat up. There was no time to feel sorry for himself. He wanted to help, and he would. Maybe if he tries more he could convince Izuku to at least fight back and escape to come back to the heroes for help. To leave his old family for safety. Mori stood up and fixed his collar. He was going to see if Izuku could change his own future without being told about it. 𝗳𝗲𝗃. That memory was tucked away in Mirai's head as he watched Izuku open presents on Christmas Day. He was happy that the boy, who had missed so much that a normal kid would experience, at least knew of the holiday. He smiled as Izuku unwrapped a new set of snowboarding gear. Goggles, gloves, pads, and more. Izuku was ecstatic. The boy opened up some hero merch gifts as well. An All Might kid-sized onesie and 2 pieces of merch from a new hero called Eraserhead. It was a hoodie and poster. He wasn't going to force Izuku to like heroes, but he did want Izuku to at least look up to them. All Might was his boss now, and Izuku sometimes went to work with Mirai. Eraserhead could erase quirks and was underground. He took on dangerous villains hand to hand after erasing their quirks. Izuku loved all his gifts, even going as far as to run to his room and put on the onesie. He re-emerged with his onesie on and 2 gifts, which he handed to Mirai. Mirai lifted a brow at the surprise gift and opened it first. Unwrapping it showed it was a tube. I always wanted a tube to put stuff in. Murray smiled at Izuku's small groan. You have to open it. Oh, Murray did just that, and suddenly his mood changed. He held up an All Might poster. An unreleased one at that. He turned to Izuku, who was smiling wide when it clicked. All Might had given this to Izuku to use as a present. A smile cracked across his face, and he put it back in its case, and then laughed as he captured the toddler in a hug at how stupid and goofy his boss and kid was. Open the other one, Izuku laughed as he hugged back. Murray nodded, released Izuku to open the other present. He saw skiing gear and smiled, hugging Izuku once more in thanks. The boy nestled into the hug quickly, something that made Murray's heart melt. The moment was ruined by the doorbell ringing. Murray let go of Izuku and, once he opened the door, he yelped as he was wrapped up in a hug by a blonde woman. Surprise. The woman spoke as she parted. Murray smiled at his mother. She was a short and thin woman, with blonde hair that was almost always in a bun and yellow eyes to match. Hello, Mom. He saw his younger brother behind his mother and waved, who took up a faux offended look. So Mom gets a hug and words, but I only get a wave. How rude. Both boys were silent before the younger one snorted and burst into laughter. Murray shook his head with a smile and looked at his mother. As much as I love the visit, why are you here? Murray asked. His mother smiled. Can't I visit my son on Christmas? She froze and pointed behind Murray. He knew what, or rather who, she was pointing at. Murray. Who's that? Izuku's 𝐬𝐬 could be seen peeking around the corner to see what was happening. Murray prevented his mother from entering. That is Izuku. He's under my care and doesn't like to be touched by people he's never met. His mother deflated at that last part but nodded. It took All Might a while to even pat him on the head. That nailed in how serious it was. He let his family in and closed the door. His mother knelt in front of Izuku, who was now on the couch. Hello, Izuku. Her voice was quiet and kind, the one a nurse would give a child about to get a shot. I'm Sasaki Ruiko. I'm Murray's mother. Murray? Izuku tested the name out and Murray took the chance to make a joke. Yes, Izuku looked at Murray and snorted at the joke. It's a good name you got for your birthday. Murray smiled wide at the first joke he told Izuku being directed at him. His brother was laughing and Ruiko smiled. She turned to Izuku once more. I'm sorry, I didn't get you any gifts because someone neglected to tell me I was technically a grandmother. Murray shrugged and picked Izuku up to sit back down with a toddler in his lap. Ruiko suddenly stood up and left the house, leaving the boys confused. So, Murray turned to his brother. Where'd the kid come from? Found him in an alleyway running from his abusive father. Izuku barely flinched at that, too busy staring at Murray's brother. The boy was a teenager, maybe 15 or 16. He had blonde hair that was tipped in green and went to his shoulders. He didn't have glasses like Murray did. His eyes were dark blue, different to Murray's yellow. Izuku moved so he was sitting sideways on his caretaker's lap and held onto his shirt. Thought you said the kid didn't like touch? He does only if he trusts you. The door opened, and the two Sasakis turned to see Ruiko come back inside, and immediately rushed to the kitchen with bags. Murray just sighed and rolled his eyes. He saw his brother stand up and get a cup from the cupboard. Izuku got off Murray's lap and stood on the couch to watch the two others. Ruiko was making cookies, and the teen poured a liquid in the glass and gave it to Izuku. Izuku smelled the drink and a sweet scent nipped at his nose, and he giggled as he carefully sat down. He took a sip and immediately loved the drink, quickly drinking the rest. The older men laughed and Murray ruffled Izuku's hair as he got his own glass. Thank you, Sakito. Murray spoke. Izuku finished his drink and asked for another glass. Murray poured some of his drink into Izuku's cup. Sakito smiled at that. It reminded him of their father, who was a stay-at-home father that loved jokes and games. Murray took after him the most. Sakito guessed that Murray had also gotten the fatherly instinct from him. Sakito was too young to remember their father. The man was an echo in his memory, but the memory was strong for his mother and older brother. He was only a toddler back then, but now that he was older he could tell that Murray, whether he knew it or not, cared for Izuku as if the boy was his own flesh and blood. Maybe that was what found family meant. Ruiko came over with hot cookies, milk, and a store-wrapped gift. She handed the gift to Izuku. The toddler opened it and smiled wide, showing the book to the other and ranting about it to everyone in the room. It was a book about heroes and their known quirks, with a red with white dots bookmark on the cover. Murray waved goodbye to his mother and brother as they left the house that night. Ruiko had made dinner for them and had left him enough leftovers to feed them for the next 2 days. He locked the door and went to the living room. Izuku was cleaning it, despite being tired. He was putting gift wrapping, tape, etc. in a black trash bag. Murray walked over to help a bit. He felt something bump his hand and found a disposable camera. He lifted a brow at the old tech and put it on the counter. He could get the film processed later. _, here are your pictures. Murray nodded his thanks and started back to his car. Looking through the photos, he chuckled. Each photo was from Christmas. Izuku opening and reading his new book. Murray and Sakito talking. The cookies. Izuku with an eggnog mustache. And more. He looked at the final one, which showed him holding Izuku on his hip, with Izuku holding on to his shirt. It seemed fatherly. It made him think. Had he become a father figure to Izuku? How hard would it be to lose him? _, on Izuku's 6th birthday. The second birthday he had celebrated with Murray, Tenya, and Tensei visited. Izuku was already bouncing off the walls, and he hadn't even had sweets yet. Buttercup had become a fully registered emotional support dog, and was in the living room being pet by Tensei. Her vest was on, but she was off duty and happy to be pet by the Ida. Murray appeared from the kitchen with lunch, and placed it on the coffee table in front of the kids, who were watching the news. Izuku was talking about the quirks he was seeing and Tenya was naming the heroes he could. One of the sandwiches on the table was grabbed by a blur of gold and brown fur, and the kids immediately gave chase, the TV forgotten as they chased Buttercup outside and around the yard. Tensei chuckled at their antics and looked towards Murray. So, what happened to Izuku's mother, if you don't mind me asking? He honestly wondered where the woman could be. He couldn't imagine that a mother would miss her son's birth. She died when he was 4. Oh, I'm sorry for your loss. A plate shattered on the floor. Murray stared at Tensei like a deer in headlights. Tensei asked bewilderedly, "Are you all right?" I'm not his father. Maybe a father figure, but not his biological father." Murray quickly began cleaning up the broken plate as it clicked in Tensei's head. "Oh, I didn't, you both just look so alike. So I assumed." The hero covered his red ears. "God, this is embarrassing. Imagine it from my end." The green-haired adult chuckled as he threw the glass shards away. The adults decided to take the kids out to a park before sundown, to burn off the energy in their systems before they got even more back in once they returned to have cake. Buttercup had to stay home since most kids couldn't resist petting her even with her vest on. The boys were running around the park and jungle gym, while the adults stood and talked. They were interrupted by a shout. "Oh my God, 𝐸𝐸 and 𝐸𝐸𝐬." Both heroes flinched and paled as both children and adults formed a crowd around them. Murray met Izuku's eyes and gestured his head towards the sidewalk. He needed the two at least in sight of people walking past. Izuku gave a nod. After a few seconds, hopped off the jungle gym. Tenya followed Izuku as they walked to the sidewalk to get away from the crowd. Izuku took deep breaths to calm his anxiety as Tenya observed the adults dealing with the crowd. Suddenly, he heard a familiar voice. "Hello, Izuku." Izuku looked up to the voice and met familiar golden eyes. He held Tenya's hand in his own and thought. He still remembered the old rules. "Dad?" Tenya looked at them confused. Kai made a noise and reached down to pick Izuku up, pulling the toddler's hands apart. "That is not your dad, Izuku." Tenya began chopping the air. Golden eyes glared at Tenya and Izuku tensed. "This is a stranger, and we should stay with Tensei and Sasaki." Tenya chopped more. The brunette stared at the toddler. Kai was pissed. This one was a problem, but he could be dealt with. Judging by the engines in the boy's legs, he'd say he was an Ida, which gave him options. He could hold the boy for ransom, sell him on the black market, or maybe even keep the kid to either make into a follower for Izuku or to experiment on. Maybe even both. He snapped his fingers that weren't busy keeping Izuku in place on his hip. Holding the boy annoyed him even more, but sacrifices had to be made to make sure he didn't bolt. Tenya was picked up as well by someone else. Someone who Izuku had never seen. He had a beak mask that covered his entire head, and a yellow mist seemed to enter it. The blue-haired toddler in the man's arms slowly closed his eyes and became limp soon after. Izuku stared at Tenya, worried sick for his friend who seemed to have fallen asleep. He watched the other man load the sleeping boy into a black car before he was placed in soon after, a seat belt locking him in place. Kai closed the door and got in the driver's seat. Izuku finally found his voice. What about Mr. Sasaki and Tenya's brother? Won't they worry? He knew they would. Sasaki always wanted to know where he was at all times. I already talked with them and got permission to take you back home. Something about that rang false, but Izuku didn't have time to protest as Kai started the car and drove away. Sir Nightai, Murray looked over at the woman. Yes, she shifted nervously. I think I just witnessed a kidnapping. That made him go pale as he began chanting no in his head over and over as the terrible thought occurred to him. What did the kids look like? One had green hair and the other had blue hair. Tensei jolted and Murray froze for a second or two before he looked and saw the black car from his nightmares driving away. His heart stopped. Tensei immediately reacted and cried out, Tenya! Murray didn't have time to even say a word as Ida took off after the car. Murray fumbled for his phone, getting to his contacts before he froze. He hadn't changed the future. The phone slipped out of his hand and fell into the grass as Murray collapsed to his knees in shock. The crowd had dispersed as word of the kidnapping spread and parents went to check their kids and worry. Meanwhile, Murray couldn't do anything except stare at his empty hands and the sidewalk. He had failed. Izuku watched his father drive as the buildings rushed by in a blur. A few minutes passed in silence. Eventually, he gathered the courage to ask a question. Where are we going? Home, of course. The answer was quick, as if his father had been expecting it. Thoughts raced through Izuku's head. The feeling of cold metal pressed against his chest brought his thoughts back into focus. His mother's locket. The mother his father killed. But you killed Mama, Izuku accused. He missed her, and the only thing he had left to remember her by was her locket. No, I didn't. She's waiting at home. You'll be able to see her. Izuku's heart leapt with joy for a second. She was alive. But he took a moment to think. Silently, he realized that his father was lying. The heroes had said she was dead, and they had never lied to him before. His father had. He had always talked about how the world beyond the fence was filthy, but it wasn't. It was vast and beautiful. His father had always said his immune system, but that was another lie. Sasaki said it was normal. Izuku still remembered when his father had struck him for refusing to use his quirk on Buttercup. The last time he had ever seen his mom as they were running away. The day he had met Sasaki and began to learn what a real family felt like. Home wasn't with his father anymore, he realized. Izuku turned his head to look at Tenya and saw the boy was still out cold. He looked back out the window, and this was that Tensei chasing after them. He looked up to the new guy, who was playing on his phone, and glanced towards his father, who seemed to have his full attention on the road in front of him. A plan came together in Izuku's head as he made his decision. Heart pounding, he splayed his bare palm out against the back of the seat, and, as quietly as he could, he overhauled a hole into the trunk. He slipped himself in, hoping that his father wouldn't notice. He peeked back out and saw that neither man was paying attention, so he reached over to drag Tenya in with him before closing the hole he made. He crawled to the other side of the trunk and made another opening in it to the outside. Looking through the hole, Izuku saw that Tensei was still closing. Izuku waved at him, and the hero sped up. As he caught up, he reached out and Izuku quickly passed Tenya into his arms. Suddenly, the car sped up, widening the gap. His dad must have noticed the hero. The sudden acceleration nearly caused Izuku to tumble out. He only barely caught himself on the sides of the hole. He stared down at the road, which was passing by far too fast and close for comfort. He didn't want to even think about how it would feel to fall on it. He saw Tensei speeding up again, holding Tenya in over one of his shoulders, but Izuku could tell he was reaching his limit. It was now or never, he realized. Izuku took a leap of faith. Izuku yelped in pain as Tensei only barely caught him by the arm. The car sped away into the distance as the hero secured his grip on Izuku and slowed to a stop, letting the boy stand on solid ground as they made their way off the road. Izuku's heart was pounding as his adrenaline rush began to fade, the boy almost collapsing right there in the middle of the street. It was only Tensei's grip that kept him upright as the hero led them to the sidewalk. As they reached it, Tensei released Izuku's arm and gently laid Tenya onto the ground. Izuku sat down as well, grateful to have solid ground under him. A small crowd had gathered and were applauding Tensei's daring rescue. The hero smiled and waved at them before turning away to make a call. Meanwhile, Izuku itched at the area where Tensei had caught him. It felt dirty. 𝐴𝐻 looked up towards the door and bolted out of his seat at the sight of Mirai. He ran over to the man, who looked shocked, but quickly scooped him up and hugged him tightly. Izuku didn't feel any itch as he hugged back. He spoke softly to Mirai, who could tell the boy was barely restraining tears. "Dad," he said, "Mama was still alive. That I could see her." Tensei's and Mirai's hearts ached. Mirai just hugged tighter while Tensei spoke. "Villains like him often lie, kiddo." Izuku nodded as he clung to the green-haired man. He had come to the same conclusion. His arm chose that moment to remind him that it still ached, and he rubbed at it lightly. Mirai noticed and gave him a cleaning wipe. Mirai watched Izuku as the boy wiped his arms clean. This isn't the future he had foreseen. It had changed. He had managed to change it. He couldn't suppress his smile if he had tried. And, for that matter, he didn't want to. Tensei interrupted his train of thought as he brought 2 members of the medical staff in to give the boys a checkup. Then he turned to Sasaki himself. "Sasaki, we need to talk." Izuku stared at the nurse wrapping his left arm in a cast. They said he sprained his forearm, probably from when he was caught. He shifted to look at Tenya, who was also being checked. So far he just seemed tired. Interrupting his thoughts, a big man wearing a costume entered the room, holding a recorder with a soft smile that belied his large stature. "Hey there, little buddy. My name's Big Shot. I'm one of 𝐀𝐦 sidekicks. Wanna tell me what happened?" Izuku thought about it before nodding. Duh, no. He didn't deserve that title anymore. "Father." That felt better. "Father showed up and told me that Sasaki and Tensei had said I could go back home with him. I don't think it was true though." Izuku continued his telling of the day's events, picking up thoughts as he did. Once he finished his story, the sidekick gave him a gentle smile as he picked up the recorder and walked to the door. "Thanks, buddy. You were very brave." I figured you should know." He jumped from a speeding car just to escape from his biological father. "I'm lucky I had the time to grab him, even if it was by his arm." The elder Ada spoke as he handed a paper cup of water to the other man. Mirai paled as Tensei told the story, taking a sip of the offered water after taking the cup. Izuku had risked his own life to escape, to get away. It really hit him then, just how close he'd come to losing him, even with the changed future. He palmed his forehead in worry. He would have to scold Izuku when they got home. As Tensei finished his retelling of the story, Mirai stood and, much to the other hero's surprise, dragged Tensei into an embrace. "Thank you so much." Mirai let the shocked hero go and quickly left the room before Tensei could recover. He ducked into the medbay to collect Izuku, and they left the agency together. The house was quiet as the 2 green-haired males returned home. Buttercup perked up and made to greet them, but a gesture from Mirai made her stay. Izuku stared at her before he turned to Sasaki, who kneeled in a familiar position and met Izuku's gaze. "Izuku," his voice was soft but stern. "What you did was very reckless and dangerous." Izuku teared up a little. "But I can't bring myself to be mad at you for saving your friend and yourself." Arms embraced him, and Izuku tensed for a few seconds before he returned it. Both stayed silent, just happy to be in the other's grip, safe. "You're like Dad." Those words made Mirai's heart sink into his stomach. He pulled away from the hug and looked at Izuku. The boy looked back. "You're like Dad, but better." Mirai felt his heart come back up. "What do you mean?" "You take care of me, feed me, give me a place to sleep, help me with my quirk. Only, you don't lie to me." Arms wrapped around Mirai again. A smile grew on his face as he hugged back tightly. A knock on the door interrupted them, bringing the heartwarming moment to an end. Izuku jumped away in panic and looked around frantically for a place to hide. He just knew that this had to be his father coming for him. Mirai frowned as he stood back up and went to answer the door. Through the peephole, he could see a familiar head of blue hair. Opening the door, Mirai watched a very sluggish Tenya walk in without a word, his gaze locking onto his friend as he moved to hug Izuku, who breathed a sigh of relief and moved to hug back upon seeing that it was only his friend. Tenya wanted to make sure Izuku was all right. Tensei spoke. Mirai looked towards him. "I filled our parents in, and they even said Tenya can sleep over if you allow it. They think it'll help calm the boys." Mirai thought about it before chuckling. The Ida family was definitely something else. "We'd better make a fort for the night then." The blue-haired hero smiled and entered. It took a while, but eventually, a fort of blankets took shape in the living room, and 2 6-year-olds were fast asleep next to each other. Tensei smiled at the kids, happy they were able to sleep soundly after such an exciting day. He stretched and yawned. The sound of a door opening and closing got his attention quickly. He looked over to see 𝐻𝐻𝐸 standing outside. Mirai turned when he heard the back door open. He silently watched Tensei sit next to him. Hey, hey, a silence other than crickets filled the air. Finally Mirai broke it. Izuku and Tenya weren't supposed to get away. Tensei looked over. Izuku, at least, wasn't going to come back. But it changed. The future I foresaw changed. Tensei listened carefully. By Sasaki's tone he could tell that this wasn't a common occurrence. Part of him was hurt that Mirai hadn't told him that his little brother would be kidnapped. But he supposed Sasaki had a reason. Plus, given how attached Sasaki was to little Izuku, it must have hurt knowing he was going to lose him. The click of a lighter caught his attention, and a glance showed Sasaki standing up and lighting a cigarette. You know, those are bad for your health. The green-haired man chuckled, moving away from the Ida. I know, but I don't do it often. Only when stressed out too much. A small plume of smoke escaped the Sasaki. Tensei opened his mouth to speak, but closed it when he saw Mirai begin to pace. In the future I foresaw, Tensei gave his full attention. Izuku never left the car. Didn't talk during the ride, and seemed lost in thought. He was taken into an underground garage, then upstairs into a room that looked as if it hadn't been touched since he left. Other than being cleaned up. Then my vision ends. Tensei gulped down a response. In the report Big Shot gave, Izuku had talked during the car ride, went into the trunk, dragged Tenya in with him, then jumped to him. The boys could have been lost to these men. Who knows what they would have done to Tenya? Tensei realized Sasaki was still talking and focused back on him. It's just so confusing. The report you have is almost the opposite from my vision. And my visions haven't been wrong like this before. Maybe Izuku was smarter than your vision gave him credit for. The green-haired man let out a laugh into the night sky. Mirai stretched out as he woke up, a few pops sounding off from his joints. A yawn also escaped him. Morning. Mirai paused as he remembered last night and the day before. He looked towards the voice and saw Tensei cooking in the kitchen. 2 bodies on his sides made their presence known by shifting around. Looking down, Mirai saw both Tenya and Izuku sleeping on him. Izuku was on Mirai's right, using his arm as a pillow and tucked in close to the adult's torso. Tenya was using Mirai's stomach as a pillow. He wasn't escaping this until the two woke up. Buttercup was outside barking at birds. Later, as Tensei was finishing cooking, Tenya stirred and Izuku simply tried to hide his face in Mirai's side, which made the adult smile and rub his back comfortingly. Eventually both woke up and made their way to the table. Mirai was silently thankful he had 4 chairs. The 3 thanked the cook and began to eat. The kids talking about their dreams, the adults listening. Izuku had a dream about his mom and godfather taking him to a park. An old memory. Tenya's was about him being a hero. Mirai and Tensei were both thankful that the dreams weren't nightmares. Eventually, it came time for the Ida brothers to head home. Tenya and Izuku said their goodbyes and Mirai and Tensei found a good day for another playdate. As soon as the door closed, it was like a switch was flipped in Izuku's mind. He immediately started cleaning. Izuku, what are you doing? Mirai was used to Izuku's cleaning habits, but there wasn't anything to really clean up. The Idas had helped put away the blankets and Tensei cleaned up after his cooking. I like cleaning. The green-hair adult simply smiled and grabbed the TV remote. He flipped a few channels before reaching his goal, a cooking channel. Izuku quickly stopped and watched the TV with amazement at the foods being cooked. Mirai watched as well, occasionally writing down the recipes and directions for the meals they both wanted to try. Buttercup joined them soon after, her head on Izuku's lap. Saying that Izuku was an outcast at school was an understatement. The spiky-haired blonde, who he later learned was named Bakugo Katsuki, seemed hell-bent on making him friendless, and it was working. No matter what he tried, he couldn't make friends with anyone, even with Bakugo himself. His teachers liked him though. He was smart, and, since he had no friends to distract him from learning, his grades were high, putting him as the teacher's pet. Even there, things weren't perfect. The teachers knew to ask for permission to put their hands on him, but had only learned that after an incident where one teacher took his quirk suppressants right out of his hands. which resulted in a panic attack and a lot of property damage. The school had tried to blame 𝐬𝐻𝐻𝐬, and 𝐬𝐈 had threatened to sue the school into oblivion. In the end, he offered to pay for the cost of fixing the warped area in return for 𝐬𝐻𝐻𝐬 being allowed his suppressants in space, and they agreed to leave it at that. At the moment, 𝐬𝐻𝐻𝐬 was busy doing his homework on the floor of 𝐬𝐈's office at All Might's agency, while his legal guardian was out helping All Might with his hero work. Buttercup was laying next to him and watched him work, her vest on and her working mode engaged. 𝐬𝐻𝐻𝐬 was almost done with his work. Soon enough, he finished his work and began to get bored, so he took out 3 pieces of paper and began to write about 𝐬𝐈's quirk. He didn't know much other than it allowed him to see into the future. The further he went, the more harder to see it became. 𝐬𝐻𝐻𝐬 knew that 𝐬𝐈's eyes changed colors when it was in use. And that was it. That was all he knew. He sketched out a drawing of his guardian on the paper as well. He grabbed another paper and started writing about All Might's quirk. He didn't know its name, so he just wrote what he thought it was. He saw air move around the man's punches, so maybe something with elements. But he's also able to leap long distances like he's flying, maybe controlling the wind so he drifts. But what happens to gravity? Plus he moves extremely fast, so a speed quirk. But how did he have more than one? Eventually 𝐬𝐻𝐻𝐬 gave up, sketched a picture of All Might on the paper, and grabbed another paper. He wrote his name at the top before drawing a line down the middle of the paper and writing down everything he learned about Overhaul on one side. Small object attraction was written on the other side. He wrote everything father had taught him about atoms, how to make things from just the parts, and how to control it. He also wrote down that he'd become exhausted when he used it too much. A drawback his father explained was to stop overuse, and his time limit would grow over time the more he used it. A yawn escaped the young boy as he sketched out a picture of himself, the line he drew earlier splitting him in half. Eventually he dozed off and napped right there on the floor. Buttercup moved to lay on top of him and fell asleep protecting her baby. 𝐬𝐈 winced in pain as he limped through the halls of Mighty Tower. Some no-name villain had kicked him in the knee in an effort to escape. It hadn't worked, of course, but it hurt like hell, and 𝐬𝐈 was fairly certain his knee had buckled. All Might walked and talked with him as they ventured through back to their offices. They opened the door to 𝐻𝐻𝐬's office, and 𝐬𝐈 had a mini heart attack. 𝐬𝐻𝐻𝐬 was sprawled out on the floor face down. Only the sight of Buttercup looking at 𝐻𝐻𝐬 calmly from her spot over the boy's back signaled that no, 𝐬𝐻𝐻𝐬 hadn't suddenly died and was just sleeping. 𝐬𝐻𝐻𝐬 didn't sleep on the bare floor often. He had a couch in his office for the boy to use. All Might chuckled and patted the man's back. The blonde was certain both of the green-haired males were still frazzled from the kidnapping attempt from a few weeks ago. 𝐬𝐈 recovered his composure and began to clean up 𝐬𝐻𝐻𝐬's mess so they could go home. Recovery Girl had told him in no uncertain terms to go home and rest his injured knee, and he didn't really want to be on the woman's bad side. As he packed up the school books and homework, his hand froze as he saw a self-portrait and words on a paper. He picked it up and read it. His eyes widened as he read the notes about both portions of 𝐬𝐻𝐻𝐬's quirk. Small object attraction required him to at least know where the object was, and it had to be small enough for him to tug. There was a weight limit, a dictionary that 𝐬𝐈 had in his office. Heavier things took longer and more energy to pull than lighter things. Like a book versus a paper. He could pull one thing per hand, and could pull whenever something was in his hand. Then there was the other half, Overhaul. 𝐬𝐈 hadn't known that it changed stuff down to the atomic level. He couldn't really change the atoms but rearrange them. Both biological and non-biological things could be changed. He could change a table to sawdust, which is how 𝐬𝐻𝐻𝐬 remembered his quirk coming in. It talked about the drawbacks and how much he could do with it, along with something that caught 𝐬𝐈's eye. 𝐬𝐻𝐻𝐬 felt an itching sensation in his hands if he didn't use his quirk often. So he had been using his quirk on his bed frame to relieve the itch. He had done this enough that he knows how many nails are in the bed. 𝐻𝐻𝐬 showed the paper to All Might, who read it over and eyes widened. The man spoke softly, knowing how light of a sleeper 𝐬𝐻𝐻𝐬 was and not wanting to wake the boy up suddenly. It's sort of terrifying, knowing that just a tap on the shoulder could do so much damage. All Might spoke, eyes scanning the paper. I know an underground hero who can help with it, if he agrees. 𝐬𝐈 spoke as he agreed with All Might. He definitely would need a bit more help with this. He picked up another paper. It was the same style, but with All Might. He showed the man the picture, and the blonde smiled as he read through it. clearly internally laughing as it became clear that 𝐬𝐻𝐻 had given up and moved on. All Might pointed at 𝐻𝐻𝐻's page. He made one of you two. Murray smiled, and tucked the 3 pages into 𝐬𝐻𝐻's bag. He gently tapped 𝐬𝐻𝐻's head 3 times before shaking the boy awake. The taps were for 𝗵𝗃𝗀 to get off and help wake 𝐬𝐻𝐻, who groaned in annoyance. All Might chuckled again. 𝗧𝗫𝗫 disappeared into his room after they got home. 𝗵𝗃𝗀 went out back to do her business, came back in for food, and then disappeared into 𝐬𝐻𝐻's room through the doggy door. Murray simply just started his call, holding the phone to his ear as he started a puzzle on the coffee table. Eventually a tired voice answered, and the man hoped he hadn't woken the other. "Hello?" Murray readied himself. "Hello, is this Aizawa Shouta A.K. Eraserhead?" He heard shuffling as the voice got clearer and had a hint of anger under it. "It is. Who's asking?" "Sasaki Murray, Sir Nightai." "What do you want?" The voice sounded bored once more. "I have a child with a dangerous quirk who needs to learn extreme control over it." He didn't want to sugarcoat anything. "I don't see how that's. It can kill someone with just a finger, Eraserhead. Do you really want a child to live with that trauma?" Murray interrupted. The line remained silent. "Just one lesson. And then you get to choose whether or not you want to continue the lessons." He didn't want to try forcing Eraserhead into anything. Given he was underground, Murray doubted that he would be able to. "Deal. Let me send you my schedule." Murray let out a breath of relief. "Thank you. Now don't call me without warning ever again." The call ended and Murray looked at the screen. He hung up on me. Aizawa looked at the paper in his hand and understood Sir Nightai's worry. He looked at the kid, who was currently petting his dog. The service dog looked at Aizawa. The raven-haired man cleared his throat. "All right, kid. Show me what you got." 𝐬𝐻𝐻 nodded and set to work on changing the gym in All Might's agency. The ground under his hands twisting and warping, black lines covering it like veins. Small towers and spikes were built. Aizawa took mental notes of everything. He gave feedback to the boy, who quickly took it in and adapted to it. Like changing his stance to be able to move out of it quickly but carefully. To say Shouta was impressed was an understatement. He'd had to deal with kids like this before, but none of them had picked up his advice that fast. He chalked it up to having been trained a bit before. Maybe another lesson wouldn't hurt. He made sure to mention that to Nightai, who thanked him and offered to pay. Aizawa left before the man could come back with his wallet. 𝗧𝗫𝗫 was eating lunch at school. His training with Eraserhead had been going on for a year now, and he was doing well in the lessons. Currently, they were working on him not using his quirk when spooked. Present Mike joined in on those sessions. He would hide in the gym and at random times during the lessons. He'd fire blanks into the air with a gun. 𝐬𝐻𝐻's job was to not overhaul anything in his hands, or that he was standing on as they found out. He could overhaul stuff through his feet. He lost shoes that day. 𝐬𝐻𝐻's train of thought was cut off when someone grabbed his bag. He immediately tried to get it back, only to watch as it was thrown into a trash can by Bakugo. 𝐬𝐻𝐻 stared at his filthy bag. His arms were grabbed and 𝐬𝐻𝐻 snapped. He grabbed the offending person's wrists and twisted. Wings, as 𝐬𝐻𝐻 knew him, fell to the ground in pain as his wrists were wringed painfully. Arms looped under 𝐬𝐻𝐻's arms, and he was lifted into the air, only to be punched in the stomach. It took all of 𝐬𝐻𝐻's restraint to not lose his lunch. When 𝐬𝐻𝐻 looked up, he saw the spiky-haired blonde watching as 𝐬𝐻𝐻 was beat up by 3 people twice his size. 𝗵𝗃𝗀 was with one of his teachers, because everyone kept trying to pet her. He could only wait for the beating to stop. No teachers were nearby to stop it. The kids beat 𝐬𝐻𝐻 until they eventually got bored and left 𝐬𝐻𝐻 curled up on the ground. 𝐬𝐻𝐻 groaned in pain, but forced himself to get up and get moving. He fished his bag out of the trash and limped to the bathroom. After making sure he was alone, he sealed the door shut. He checked his face for bruising before undressing to look under his clothes. This wasn't the first time he had been beaten, and he had long since taught himself how to fix his own injuries, so he wouldn't be a bother. He laid his hand over the bruises he could see, and he felt a sharp pain as he overhauled his injuries. After checking again that he'd healed every bruise, he redressed. He gingerly grabbed his bag, ignoring his internal disgust as he carried it around the school for the rest of the day. Finally, the school day had ended, and he found himself waiting inside the schoolyard for Aizawa to pick him up for their training. They were starting something new today, Eventually, the perpetually tired man rounded the corner, and Izuku stood up from his sitting position, only to freeze up as something wet and slimy slammed into the back of his head. The next thing Izuku knew, Aizawa had the red-winged student's wrist in his grasp and was glaring at the boy. "Did you know that counts as assault?" The chubby student paled and went stiff in fright. Aizawa didn't care as he dragged the winged student straight to the principal office, with Izuku following behind. The principal looked up and glared at Aizawa. "Why are you manhandling one of my students?" "Because this one assaulted the other. I'm debating on arresting him." Aizawa glared. He wasn't actually planning to arrest the kid. Too much paperwork. But he would if he didn't get the proper response. "Who are you to arrest my students? Especially one of our top students. I'm a hero." He showed his license as proof and watched as the color drained from the man's face. Let's not be too hasty now." He became nervous. He turned to his computer and said he'd look at the cameras and promised to punish the winged boy. That was enough to satisfy 𝐲𝗧𝗏, who nodded before turning around and leaving with Izuku in tow. Izuku didn't fight Aizawa, cleaning him up, getting him his spare clothes, and a new backpack for him. Aizawa didn't ask any questions yet. He was still thinking of what would have caused this. Izuku was a very reserved, respectful boy. Sure, he didn't have many friends, but he had thought that was just his style. What he had seen today made him wonder. "Izuku," the raven-haired man cleared his throat. Meeting his green and gold eyes, he asked the question that had been burning in him. "Is that normal?" The dual-colored eyes suddenly refused to meet his, and that was all the answer he needed. "Do your stretches to start training." The boy nodded, looking almost relieved, and set off stretching. Aizawa watched for a while before pulling his phone out and texting Nighthigh. "𝐲𝗏, I think Izuku has a bully problem." "Sasaki, what do you mean? I was never told of anything like that." "𝐲𝗏, when I picked him up, another student had thrown mud at him. The principal claims he'll do something about it, but I don't know if he'll actually follow through." "Sasaki, I'll ask Izuku about it when we get home. Just continue the training." 𝐲𝗏 could understand that. Sasaki probably needed time to think about what to say and how to get the answer out of Izuku. When he looked up at his student, he saw the 7-year-old making pillars and jumping from one to the other, destroying the one he had jumped off of and making a new one in front of the one he was jumping to. "𝐲𝗏, if it's a recurring problem, you should homeschool him. Would help with keeping him hidden from his father as well." "Sasaki, I'll take that into consideration." Izuku was quiet. Sasaki noted during the car ride home after training. That silence continued as he parked, and they both entered the house. Izuku wrapped his arms around Buttercup and laid on the floor for a bit as Murray changed into more casual clothes and prepared himself for the upcoming discussion. "Izuku, what happened at school today?" Izuku stilled and went even more silent than before. Murray's heart tightened as he recognized that particular type of silence. It was one he sometimes saw with prolonged victims of villains. This was a child that he had been raising for almost 3 years, and Izuku wasn't even looking at him. One thing was clear to Murray. This had to be addressed, but he wasn't quite sure how. An idea hit the man, and he leaned on the wall, folded his arms, and stared at the back of the boy on the floor. "Izuku," the boy looked behind himself. "It wasn't your fault." A look of confusion came over the boy's face. "It wasn't your fault. I heard you the first time." Izuku sat up. Murray repeated himself again. "It wasn't your fault." His heart ached as he saw Izuku starting to tear up. "Cut it out. I heard you the first time." Murray repeated himself once more. "It wasn't your fault." Izuku got up. "Stop, you sound creepy." The smaller boy pushed against the taller man's chest. Murray didn't move. He gently grasped Izuku's wrists. "Izuku, it wasn't your fault." Finally, Izuku's walls came crashing down. The dam broke and Murray had his 7-year-old kid hugging him for dear life. "I'm sorry. I didn't want to add on to your workload," Izuku whimpered through sobs. Murray felt like he had failed Izuku once more and hugged the boy closely. By time Izuku had mostly calmed down, Murray had bits and pieces of the story. He silently scolded himself. For all his foresight, he hadn't seen the signs from the child who needed him. So instead, he made a choice. "I'm taking you out of public school and into private school." Izuku simply nodded and clung to his embrace. Murray ran a hand over Izuku's hair and found the end of it. It occurred to him that it was getting fairly long. your hair is getting long. I like it like that. Izuku looked at him. Then you better behave or I'm gonna steal it. Mirai joked, poking the tip of Izuku's nose. Izuku giggled and nodded before a yawn broke out of him, which caused Mirai to yawn. Let's get some takeout then go to bed. Mirai pulled out his phone and looked at nearby places to order food from. Okay. Izuku parted from Mirai and stretched his arms and legs out. Maybe when it starts snowing again, we can go out and find another hill. The call button was pressed and Mirai held his phone up to his ear. I'd like that. A small smile appeared on Izuku's face. Izuku hopped happily through the snow towards the skiing slopes, Mirai in tow. He was excited for today. It was a day just for him and Mirai to have fun. As he walked, he saw Mirai fall back a little bit but thought nothing of it. Just that he's having trouble in the snow. His assumption was proven wrong when Mirai scooped him up from the back and tossed him into a snow pile. Izuku let out a small yelp as he became embedded in the pile of snow. Mirai chuckled as Izuku tried to dig himself out and started to help. But the second he got close enough to his kid, he got a face full of snow and heard giggling. He wiped his face clean and laughed as he finished freeing Izuku. With that now done and both males thoroughly snow-covered, they made their way up the hill with the sled behind them. Izuku was hopping in the snow as they walked up. Eventually the two made it to the top, and Mirai sat down on the sled with Izuku in front of him. Once he was sure Izuku was ready, he pushed and went down the slope with the boy. Once they reached the bottom, Mirai got off the sled and started towards the car as Izuku went back up to go again. By the time he got back, Izuku was waiting for him. So he traded Izuku's snowboard for the sled, which Izuku gladly took and got his gear on before heading up the beginner's ramp. Mirai went back to the car and put the sled in the back of the car on a towel. He grabbed his own gear and put it on before grabbing his skis. He headed towards the beginner's ramp and stuck his skis in the snow at the bottom in a safe place. Just as Izuku started down the hill, he watched the kid wipe out halfway and quickly caught him towards the bottom, wiping off Izuku's snow-covered face. Gonna go again? The quick nod was all he needed before he watched Izuku go to the hill again. Mirai, however, took a ski lift up to the hill he was skilled for and headed down once he was in place. Soon enough, Izuku grew tired of his rides down the hill and his wipeouts, so he climbed up a snow pile and looked for Mirai, soon finding him in the middle of his way down the mountainside. Izuku wondered when he'd get to that level. Soon enough, Mirai was back and Izuku slid down the hill to his guardian. They heard a gentle laugh, and the two turned to see a woman with black hair and red eyes looking at them with a similar-looking child in tow, who seemed to be about Izuku's age. You and your son are very cute together. You both look so much alike. Thank you. Mirai rubbed the back of his neck. He wasn't going to deny it anymore if people thought of them as father and son. Then so be it. Izuku, however, realized that his gold eye looked similar to Mirai's yellow and got lost in thought. You're welcome. My name is Kirishima Kyojin, and this is my son, Ijiru. Kyojin put her hand on the back of her son's head. Ijiru waved happily at the two. My name is Sasaki Mirai, and this is Izuku. Mirai placed a hand on Izuku's head, who was hugging the older man's leg as he watched the two Kirishimas. Izuku got interested in Ijiru and looked up at Mirai, who raised a brow in response. You don't have to ask me permission to play with kids your age, kiddo. At that, Izuku turned to Ijiru and the two boys ran off to play in the snow, leaving the adults to watch and chat. So is it just you and your mom? Izuku asked halfway through building a snowman with Ijiru. Yeah, never met my dad. You? Ijiru didn't seem bothered by not knowing his dad. Just me, my dad, and our dog. Izuku used his quirk to help keep the snowman stable. You have a dog? Lucky. Our landlord doesn't allow pets. Ijiru smiled wide. The two boys continued to chat about animals and pets. Ijiru liked feeding the stray cats around his home. Izuku wondered what their fur felt like. Eventually, it came time to go home and the boys ran to their parents. Can I hang out with Kiri-chan more? The two adults looked at each other. I don't see why not. Kyojin spoke first, pulling her phone out and giving her number to Mirai. You just keep giving me new contacts, don't you? Mirai teased as he picked up Izuku, who laughed. Mirai smiled at Izuku making friends with kids his age. Mirai slowly opened his eyes to a blurry world. He rolled onto his side and onto the floor. With a huff, he sat up and reached for his glasses on the nightstand. He looked at his bed with clearer vision and saw that Buttercup had gotten into his bed during the night, and he had been pushed towards the edge. The golden retriever looked at him as she licked her nose. "Good morning to you too, Buttercup." The green-haired male stood up and stretched out his limbs, listening to the various pops. "Shouldn't you be in Izuku's room?" Buttercup simply rolled over onto her back and took up his entire bed. Murray just rolled his eyes as he got dressed and went to the kitchen. He started his coffee and looked at the calendar for the day. He had his work, and Izuku had training with Aizawa today. But, luckily, there was no school to deal with. He heard Izuku's alarm go off and set to work on breakfast, Buttercup having stirred from his bed to beg for food. His coffee machine beeped to tell him it was hot enough, and he quickly worked on his mug when he realized something was off. Izuku's alarm was still blaring. Usually the boy would wake up, or at least hit the snooze button before long. Growing concerned, he placed the mug down and knocked on the door to his kid's room. "Izuku?" No response. "Can I come in?" Murray listened closely and heard nothing, so he cracked open the door after waiting a few seconds. He froze when he saw Izuku laying on the floor, legs tangled in the blanket, wheezing, and eyes squeezed shut. Murray quickly put a hand on Izuku's forehead and frowned at the heat he felt. This was the first time Izuku had gotten this sick with him, so he scooped his kid up and brought him to the living room and laid him on the couch so he could turn off the stove and put what would have been breakfast away. He would have to take Izuku to the doctor's office, just to make sure it was the flu and not something else. Later, having returned from the doctor's office, Murray laid Izuku on the couch once more and went to the kitchen to get Izuku some medicine and something light for Izuku to eat. Izuku simply curled up. Murray pulled out his phone and texted All Might about the situation. His hero simply replied with a thumbs-up emoji. Murray then walked to the couch and handed Izuku his meds, both the prescribed ones and his quirk suppressants. The green-haired boy sat up and downed the pills. He looked upset, not that Murray could blame him. "I thought my immune system wasn't weak." Izuku's voice was quiet and hoarse. Murray looked up at him. "You said it wasn't weak." "What?" Sasaki ran a hand through his hair. "Izuku, what I meant by that was it's normal for your age. Kids get sick like this sometimes." Add that to a list of things he needs to teach Izuku. Murray swears that with each new thing he learns of Izuku, his hatred of his ward's biological father only grows. Izuku slowly nodded and drank his water before laying down and curling up. "Can I watch something?" A smile creeped onto Murray's face, and he ruffled Izuku's hair. "Of course, but it has to be in your room, so I'll set up the tablet in there." After giving a warning to both Tensei and Kyojin that it was possible that they may have caught the flu from Izuku, Murray got Izuku fed and into bed with a wet cloth on his forehead. He set up a hero film for him to watch and turned the volume up so Izuku could hear. After he made sure Izuku would be okay, he closed the door and went to the coffee table, sitting down and starting a puzzle to pass the time. Buttercup soon joined him. "Did you come into my bed after you realized he was sick?" The single bark he got in response was all the answer he needed. Rude. All Might knocked on Murray's office door, a stack of papers in one arm. He waited for a response. "It's open." With that, he opened the door. Nightai's desk was cleared off, and the man was laying on the couch in the room, one arm over his eyes. A store-bought coffee on the floor next to him. Rough night. All Might placed the stack of papers on his sidekick's desk and moved to kneel by him. "Kinda, Izuku has the flu, so he's currently being watched by Aizawa while I'm here. He's miserable." Murray moved his arm to look at his boss. "He hates being sick. His germophobia is at its worst, and he can't even get up to care for himself without throwing up." "Well, his father," All Might started. "If you can even call him that." Murray sat up, his words laced with venom. All Might had to admit it was terrifying in a sense, especially since Murray has a resting bitch face, as he heard some people say. "Right." All Might shifted lightly. Izuku was raised in an environment where he wasn't really exposed to any sickness, so his immune system is probably freaking out at the new threat. "Oh," All Might fished his phone out of his pocket and looked through his messages. "That reminds me." Murray looked at his hero confused. Of course he knew Izuku wasn't exposed to the outside world very often before he took him in. But what did his Murray moved his head back a little when All Might turned his screen and showed him a picture of a blonde girl who looked just a year or two older than Izuku. "All Might? This is my niece, Melissa." Murray looked at All Might in shock. He was trusted enough for All Might to share his private life. She just finished her first ever invention, then got sick soon afterwards. Murray softly smiled and listened to All Might talk to him. It made him relax more than he thought it would. Eventually Murray's shift ended, and he returned to his home. He saw 𝗵𝗃𝗀 running around the fenced-in front yard. She hopped onto the gate as soon as she saw him. "Down, girl." Immediately she got down and moved away from the gate, allowing Murray to get through it. He entered the house and 𝗵𝗃𝗀 trotted to 𝐬𝐻𝐻𝐿's room, only to immediately turn around and go to the living room. 𝐲𝐻𝐬 let out a grunt from the living room as he pushed her away from him. Murray knocked on the wall, getting the raven-haired man's attention. "How's 𝐬𝐻𝐻𝐻?" Murray leaned on the wall. "Better, but he just had to take a shower because he threw up in his sleep. So he's laying on the couch right now." 𝐲𝐻𝐬 pointed his pen to the couch. "He's awake." "And you?" Murray moved over and leaned over the couch, looking down at 𝐬𝐻𝐻𝐻. "Paperwork." There were 2 piles on the coffee table. Most likely done and not done. Ah, that curse! Murray could have sworn he saw a ghost of a smile on 𝐲𝐻𝐬's face after he said that. "I'm hungry." 𝐬𝐻𝐻𝐻 looked up at Murray. His hair was still soaking wet. "I'll cook up some udon then. Do you want any, 𝐲𝐻𝐬?" The other man shrugged and turned back to his paperwork. "Sure, I could use some food for the road." Murray nodded and set to work on making dinner for 3. Eventually 𝐲𝐻𝐬 left after eating his share of the food, paperwork tucked under his arm. Both of the green-haired males said their goodbyes. Murray went to his room and made a few phone calls to people he needed to call for work, mostly police detectives. 𝐬𝐻𝐻𝐻 was left to slowly finish his meal in silence. Once done, he moved back to the couch and started to watch the news. Murray came back out and sat next to his ward, ruffling his hair and getting a smile out of him. "I'm feeling better." 𝐬𝐻𝐻's voice was still hoarse, but it was getting better. "Sounds like it." Murray felt his phone buzz, and he opened up the message app. He saw that All Might sent a picture to him, so he opened it and saw 2 tickets. Then came the next message. "All Might. Wanna go to a hero party?" Murray's brows furrowed as he read All Might's text and replied. 𝐶𝐻𝐬𝐬. What do you mean?" "All Might. It's a hero party. It's kinda like a gala. It's where the top 10 heroes go to party, relax, and chat with other heroes. Usually they host charity events too." "𝐶𝐻𝐬𝐬, you. Relax? That's surprising, All Might. Haha, very funny. 𝐶𝐻𝐬𝐬. How many tickets do you have?" "All Might. I can always request more." 𝐶𝐻𝐬𝐬. Are kids allowed? And when is it?" "All Might. Kids are allowed, yes. The 𝐸𝐻𝐻 family often go. They take up an entire table, and it's in a few months. They need to get the list of people coming and plan accordingly, 𝐶𝐻𝐬𝐬. Okay, I'll come. I'll be bringing 𝐬𝐻𝐻𝐻. He'll probably stay by me. Or be with his friend 𝗀𝐻𝐬. All Might. I'll get the tickets then. See you at work tomorrow." 𝐶𝐻𝐬𝐬𝐬. I'll be able to come in, yes. All Might. Great. Oh, by the way, it's formal wear only, so you might need to buy 𝐬𝐻𝐻 a suit ~~ soon enough. It was 𝐬𝐻𝐻's 8th birthday, and he had a party to celebrate at a park with 𝗀𝐻𝐬 and 𝐸𝐻𝐻. There was a nearby woods with trees that 𝐬𝐻𝐻 liked to climb. Murray had been skeptical about letting him do that, especially after one time when the branch 𝐬𝐻𝐻 had just stepped on snapped. But, luckily, he had been holding a branch above him, which saved him from a nasty fall. There hadn't been any incidents before or since, and the act of climbing made his boy happy, so Murray allowed it. At the moment, however, there was no tree climbing, as the kids were busy eating the cake with their respective guardians. "Hey 𝐬𝐻𝐻," 𝗀𝐻𝐬 looked at 𝐬𝐻𝐻, placing his empty plate down. Once 𝐬𝐻𝐻 returned his look, he continued. "I have to introduce you to my friend Momo when you come to Summy next week." 𝐬𝐻𝐻 smiled at his friend. He couldn't wait. Online schooling was boring. Soon enough, the boys had their fill and were running around playing tag. Kiri was it, and 𝐬𝐻𝐻 had already been caught, so he was sitting next to the bushes. Finally, with a running tackle, the raven-haired boy caught the blue-haired one, and they busted out laughing. The kids stopped when they heard a grunt and a woman scream. Kiri's and 𝗀𝐻's eyes widened in horror. 3 villains had appeared, one attacking Murray, one attacking 𝗀𝐻, and the last one was holding 𝐀𝐦 hostage. 𝗀𝐻 heard 𝐬𝐻𝐻 scream and yelp as he was pulled into the bushes behind him. Both boys ran after their friend's voice. They caught up just in time to see a man with blonde hair and a black hat trying to pull 𝐬𝐻𝐻 off his arm. There was blood dripping from it. Following the streams lead to the sight of a green-haired 8-year-old with his teeth sunken into the blonde man's arm. Seeing his friends, 𝐬𝐻𝐻 let go and quickly bolted away with them. They were running as fast as their legs could go. Kiri even having gotten onto Tenya's back in order to keep up. Izuku stopped in a clearing, looked about, and started to run about, placing his hands on the trees nearby and using his quirk on several to distract any pursuers. He opened the last one up and waved for his friends to follow, pulling them in close and closing the tree back up, engulfing them into complete darkness. 𝗀𝗀𝗀, the little shit bit me. I'm bleeding. Minamoto held his bitten arm as he looked at the wound. It was still bleeding a lot, and he could tell it'd probably scar over. A cold breeze suddenly surrounded him as eyes glared holes into his back. What did you just say? The voice was soaked in venom. Oh, I'm so sorry, Overhaul-sama. I let my emotions guide my words. Shin quickly turned around and bowed as low as he could go. It won't happen again. Overhaul glared, but decided that punishment could come later. They only had so much time to catch Izuku. Then shut up and keep looking. They couldn't have gotten far. With that command, Minamoto and Sakaki darted off in the direction they saw the boys go. Kai followed slowly, double-checking the areas he walked past. He hated being in here, but he needed to use his quirk on Izuku, specifically to paralyze him just long enough for him to be brought home. Kai would have loved to fight Sir Nightai for daring to touch and corrupt his successor, but that would have to wait. Eventually, they reached a clearing. Minamoto and Sakaki quickly moved to see if they could see if the kids left any tracks. Kai, however, noticed something strange with the trees and raised a brow. They had been overhauled, but not very well. He smirked under his mask as he realized that it meant Izuku ran through here, and had quite possibly hid here. You know, Izuku, you have my quirk. I can tell when someone inexperienced uses it to try and hide. Hidden in one of the trees, Izuku's eyes widened at the close proximity of his father's voice, and he covered his mouth in fear. Kai overhauled a tree down to splinters, only to have a golden orb weaver fall down onto his shoulder. A shrill scream came out of the normally stoic Yakuza, causing his workers to run to his aid. The spider was stomped on repeated once it hit the ground. Kai began to itch his shoulder in disgust. He walked to the biggest tree, laid a bare hand on it. It had been hollowed out by Overhaul earlier. Izuku. His voice was quiet but strained. You have one chance to come out and come home. If you do this, I'll leave your friends unharmed and I won't take them. If Izuku didn't know that Tenya and Kiri were squished up next to him, he would have assumed that they had been found by the older Chisaki. So he hugged them even closer. Kai let out an annoyed huff of air. All he could hear was birds chirping. All right, but just remember. Black lines shot up and down the tree. I gave you an out. The tree split open under his hand. I will always find you. Kai glared as he split the tree open only to reveal an empty trunk. So, Izuku wanted to play tricks, did he? Well, Kai had his own tricks to play. He knelt down slowly, cringing as his bare hand met cold, wet, and dirty grass. Black lines shot across the ground, and, within the seconds of them appearing, the forest was leveled. 𝗀𝗀𝗀 Murray let out a hard grunt as he hit the ground, the wind nearly knocked out of him. The villain above him had managed to grab him by the arms and was pinning him to the grass. He heard trees break, a scream, and then the sounds of a forest being reduced to nothing. When he looked over at the noise, the villain laughed. Her voice was like ice in his blood. Seems that the young master is getting angry at his successor running away. Murray's eyes widened as he realized why the villain was here. She was a distraction. Chisaki Kai, Izuku's father, was here and was chasing Izuku. Murray's shock shifted to rage as he quickly kicked the woman above him in the stomach, pushing her off. He wasted no time while she was recovering and launched himself off the ground, ran behind her, and wrapped his arms around her neck, putting her in a chokehold, his legs around her waist to help keep her from pulling him off. She struggled against his hold, even trying to pull him off by his hair, but Murray refused to let go of her until her movement stopped. Once he was sure she was down, he loosened his grip, got up, and looked towards Tensei and 𝐀𝐦. 𝐀𝐦 was still being held hostage by a villain, who seemed a bit more nervous now that Murray's attention was on him. Yellow eyes flickered over to Tensei's form, just in time to see the man kick the villain he was fighting in the chest. 𝗀𝗀𝗀 Izuku sat on the forest floor, shocked into stillness. His breathing was labored as he looked up at his father. He saw the monster that hit him all those years ago again. Only this time, he knew they were the same person. As soon as Kai took a single step towards him, he shook himself out of his shock and booked it. Tenya followed suit with Kiri still on his back. Izuku, get back here. Izuku's eyes filled with tears as he heard his father yell out. He didn't want to go back. He wanted to stay outside. He wanted to stay with Marie. Izuku was suddenly surrounded in a cold breeze and felt as if someone was carrying him, even with his feet moving. He could feel his feet hitting the ground still. It was oddly calming, like talking to an old friend. Eventually the feeling stopped and adrenaline kicked in full force. Once Izuku got the courage to, he looked behind himself just in time to see a blue ghostly figure with long hair fade into nothing. He wondered if it was his mother, giving him some help from beyond the grave. But now wasn't the time. He got to a steep hill and looked behind himself once more. Kai was getting closer again. He didn't have time to worry about getting dirty actually. Izuku quickly rolled himself down the hill, getting covered in dirt, mud, grass, and leaves. He ignored his forming hives and disappeared into the next forest of trees with 𝐀𝐦 and 𝐍𝐸 not far behind. Kai stopped at the top of the hill. He was panting a little, his pants were covered in mud and dirt. His hair had leaves in it, and one of his shoes had a dead spider on the underside. They wouldn't be able to get down there and figure out where Izuku went in time. Rage began to boil up under the Yakuza's skin. He looked to his right and saw Minamoto looking into the forest. Quickly, an ungloved hand grabbed the blonde by the throat. You had one job. Keep a hold of Izuku while I make my way over. And you let him go because he bit you. Shin felt the hand around his neck tighten. Then you have the gall to say he was a little shit. Sakaki kept his distance. Even while a bit tipsy, he knew not to be within Overhaul's reach when the man was pissed. Kai couldn't complete his sentence before 2 feet planted themselves right in the center of his back, sending him tumbling down the hill. Minamoto and Sakaki weren't too far behind him, with Sakaki having been kicked as well, while Minamoto had fallen down alongside Kai. Kai glared up the hill, meeting eyes with 𝐸𝐸. He got up to his knees. Hello, child thief? Kai hissed at the hero. He felt extremely dirty everywhere, and he could feel the hives beginning to form. You're one to talk, villain. Marie glared down at his ward's father, taking in the man's looks. He was wearing a green coat with dark purple fur lining the hood, and a black mask over his face. Marie finally could put a face to the name of the man he hated. Kai looked at Minamoto and Sakaki. Both were out cold. He was filthy, and there's no way he'd be able to fight off 𝐸𝐸 and 𝐸𝐸𝐬 in a 2v1 fight with how he feels right now. Not in an area he wasn't familiar with. You win this round, Sasaki Mirai. But I'll be back for my son. Kai hit the ground and it bent to his command, swallowing him and his men quickly, and they disappeared without a trace. Mirai and Tensei quickly went back to back, staying in the position until they were completely sure that the man and his goons were gone. Kyojin ran up to them. They quickly calmed down and looked at her. She held up her index finger in the one-moment pose as she caught her breath. Soon enough, she was standing up straight and smiled at the 2 men. I put all the stuff into my car, so no one steals it, and your sidekicks are loading up the villains, Ida-kun. Tensei smiled. Thank you, Tensei spoke first. But first, we have to find the kids. The villains were here, so that at least gives us an idea of where they went. Marie nodded in agreement. Kyojin nodded. I hope they're okay. Considering Chisaki didn't have any of the kids, it's probably safe to assume that they're safe. Marie spoke before quickly sliding down the hill, not caring for any stains he might get on his pants and shirt. Kyojin and Tensei joined him as well. They all went into the forest in front of them and began to call out to their respective kid. Ijiru watched over a passed-out Izuku and 𝐀𝐦. They'd barely made it into the forest when they both collapsed. He managed to drag them under an uprooted tree that was barely standing and ready to tip over. He was curled up next to them when he heard their names being called. Izuku, 𝐸𝐸, 𝐀𝐦, 𝐸𝐸𝐬, Ijiru. That was his mom. He perked up and waited for another call, just in case. He heard his name again and screamed as loud as his vocal cords would allow. Mama, Kyojin, Tensei, and Mirai froze in place. They listened in for the voice to come again. Mama. That's Ijiru. Kyojin teared up and ran towards the voice. Mama's coming, Iji. Come on then. Tensei grabbed Mirai's wrist and tugged him along as they both ran behind Kyojin. Mirai wondered why he didn't hear Izuku or 𝐀𝐦. His mind quickly wandered into the territory of his mind that he hated so much. What if Izuku was hurt? What if he had been separated from his friends while escaping? Why wasn't Izuku shouting too? Did Izuku not trust him anymore? Was he unconscious? Was he too far to hear them? How far did he run into the woods? Did a wild animal get to him? Did Chisaki kill him for some reason? What if Chisaki did have Izuku, and he just didn't notice? I found them. Murray was pulled from his thoughts as 𝐀𝐻𝐦's voice snapped him out of his thoughts and Tensei slowed to a stop. 𝐀𝐻𝐦 was knelt in front of a tree. She pulled out Tenya, then Ijiru, and finally Izuku. Murray gently but quickly took Izuku in his arms and knelt down on the forest floor. He wiped dirt off of his kid's face and checked for injuries. Izuku wasn't hurt. He was still breathing. Murray's shoulders shook lightly as he held his kid to his chest in relief. Yeah, maybe we should not go out on Izuku's birthdays anymore. Murray shot a glare at the speed hero, who let out an awkward laugh as he rubbed the back of his neck with his free hand. Izuku clung to Murray as they entered the house. Buttercup saw Izuku's panicked state and immediately switched into her work mode. Murray watched as the Golden Lab closed the curtains and blinds with learned skill. She grabbed the weighted blanket and started to head into the living room, dragging it behind her. It was a slow process, but it was a heavy blanket and gave Murray time to prepare. Murray quickly started a warm shower for Izuku, managed to get Izuku to let go in order to clean up, and left the bathroom. He waited outside it like promised, but he knew he'd not be easily let go again. So he quickly called Aizawa. He heard it get picked up quickly. The man must have been on his phone already. What did I say about Rando? Izuku was almost kidnapped by his father. Murray slid down the wall. Can you do me a favor and get food for me and Izuku? He's basically clinging to me like a lifeline and won't be so easily taken off. Like super gluing a coin to the sidewalk. He heard a sigh. Okay, I'll get you guys some food. But do I need to knock a certain way to not scare Izuku? Yes, 3 times on the side and twice on the center. The knocks will sound a different pitch. The sound of the shower was the only noise Murray could hear on his end, until a familiar voice sounded off through the phone. 𝐲𝐸, who are you talking to? They weren't near the phone, but could be heard clearly. Shut up, I have to go somewhere and no you can't come. 𝐲𝐸 was muffled a bit, probably having moved the phone away to talk. Is it about that little green-haired kid you train? Murray kept silent. Yes. Sorry about that, Sasaki. I'm with my friend at the moment. That seemed to be the wrong choice of words because next thing Murray knew, Present Mike was screaming loudly. You called me your friend. Rubbing his ear with one hand and keeping the phone away from him, Murray still heard the next shout as clear as day. Damn it, Hisashi, what did I say about using your quirk in my house? The call ended from 𝐲𝐸's side. Murray heard the shower stop and saw Izuku step out in new clothes and his hair tied up in a ponytail. Murray stood up and felt the boy immediately latch back onto him. He was about to move to the couch when he finally heard a voice that shattered his heart into pieces. I don't want to leave. Izuku's face was hard to see at the angle of the cling, but Murray knew that Izuku had to be crying, still silent as ever. I want to stay outside. Murray got to the couch and pulled the weighted blanket up and onto the back of it. I want to stay with you. Murray sat down on the couch and hugged his ward, who cried silently into his shoulder. Murray didn't know how long they stayed like that until Izuku had fallen asleep in Murray's hold, the weighted blanket now laid over him, and he couldn't care less as he fought off his own tears. After a while, the sound of 5 knocks, 2 of which were different pitches, caught Murray's attention, and he texted 𝐲𝐸, not wanting to wake his kid up with talking. Sir Night-Eye, key is under the mat. Murray felt Izuku start to stir and ruffled the boy's hair softly, hoping to get Izuku back to sleep just for a little bit longer. However, the sound of the door unlocking and then closing again woke Izuku up fully. He looked over the couch and relaxed when he saw 𝐲𝐸 with bags, so he curled back up into Murray's chest, listening to the steady beat of the man's heart. Sorry about having to hang up, but I thought you hearing me yelling wasn't going to help anyone. It's fine, I had assumed so. Murray watched Izuku look off into nothing, seemingly lost in thought as Aizawa placed the bags on the coffee table. I think I saw my mom. Both adults stopped cold and looked at Izuku for context. I saw a blue figure with long hair after I got a bit faster. I looked behind me and saw it. Do you think you could draw it? So we have an idea of what it looks like? Izuku nodded at Murray's request. Izuku sat up and wrapped the blanket around his shoulders, while Murray got up and grabbed the tablet from the desk. Izuku gently took the electronic as the man handed it to him, and quickly set to drawing the ghostly figure as he tried to remember what they had looked like. Murray sorted through the food and went to the kitchen in order to get the silverware needed. 𝐲𝐸 stayed on the floor and somehow had a sleeping bag that he didn't carry in. He looked over Izuku's shoulder as he passed by, seeing that a good portion of the head was visible, but only one shoulder. Izuku was seemingly adding extra details now. It could also have been a family member that has been haunting you, 𝐲𝐴 said blankly. Murray had quickly learned how 𝐲𝐴 said things sarcastically, and easily realized the comment was sarcastic. Izuku didn't. Izuku then laid the tablet on the coffee table and moved to sit on the ground. The adults looked over the drawing. It was done completely in shades of blue, but the head and shoulders were the only part of it. Murray quickly stood up and grabbed one of Izuku's drawings of his mother, and laid the two side by side. The ghost is a lot thinner, plus the hair is shorter. Aizawa was the first to make that comparison. Plus it's a more masculine frame, but I'm not assuming gender just based off of the face. The hair is covering one eye and not in a bun. Murray pointed that out as well, showing that Izuku's drawing of 𝐀𝐦 was very different from the drawing of the ghost. The drawing was of a man. He had hair that went to his shoulders and covered one eye. He had a faint smile on, and his clothes seemed to be a V-neck t-shirt. Izuku seemed confused very quickly. Then who was it? I've never seen someone that looks like this. Izuku looked up at the two adults. Maybe it is an old family member. We could track your family tree. I've been meaning to get that done, but never really had the time. Murray saved the drawing on the tablet and turned it off. We could do that now. Just have to order the kits. Kits? 𝐲𝐴's voice came from the floor on the other side of the table. What's a family tree? And that was Izuku's. Murray took a breath before speaking. First off, I thought it'd be nice for all three of us to do it. To see our own family trees as well. He looked towards 𝐲𝐴's general direction. That makes sense. There was the sound of a sleeping bag moving, but it quickly faded and the man went quiet. Murray turned to Izuku, who was looking under the table. Secondly, a family tree is basically a way to track your family's relatives and past. Like, when did Sasaki get entered into my family name? Izuku looked over at Murray. And it would show us when Sasaki entered into your family. Izuku nodded and started to eat the food Aizawa had brought over. Murray set to work on ordering the 3 kits for them. After seeing that delivery time was a week long and the confirmation that his order was placed, he placed his phone down and sat with Izuku and ate. When Izuku asked for an All Might movie to watch, 𝐲𝐴 let out a loud groan of disapproval. Izuku giggled and Murray hit a snicker. Both adults relaxed a bit more, as they knew Izuku was starting to calm down. A few days passed, and Izuku was watching the news when Murray returned from a shift of work. So he peeked over the couch and watched his dad come into the room. The kits came. I'll text 𝐲𝐴 to come over so we can do it at the same time. Izuku nodded before pausing. When did Aizawa-sensei and Murray get on a first-name basis? Murray saw a puzzled look on Izuku's face, but slightly ignored it. If Izuku had a question he could ask. He pulled his phone out and started texting the raven-haired man. After 30 minutes of waiting and watching Izuku get lost in his own head, Aizawa finally got to the apartment. Izuku ran to the door while Murray was in the kitchen making dinner. A whine sounded out and Murray immediately felt worry. I'm fine, Izuku, just got hurt at work. The worry faded a bit. Aizawa probably had bandages covering a wound or a bruise somewhere visible. Izuku didn't like seeing either of them hurt. There was a lot of hushed whispering and curiosity got the better of Murray. So he headed to the door and peeked around the corner when he saw a scene that made his heart skip a beat. Aizawa was kneeling on the ground, Izuku's hands around his forearm, black vein-like lines wrapping around the older man's arm. A look of pure concentration was heavily present on Izuku's face, his hands moving around the bruise carefully. It was getting smaller and smaller the more Izuku's hands moved, until it was no longer visible. Now reconnect the nerves. Reconnect the what? Izuku nodded, and the black lines that had been trailing up and down 𝐲𝐴's forearm disappeared. There you go. You healed it. Izuku squealed happily and hugged Aizawa tightly, arms around the man's neck. Aizawa met eyes with Night-Eye. Looks like we've been busted. 𝐲𝐴, Murray said quietly. He saw Izuku look over his shoulder at his guardian. The look of joy Izuku had held previously was slowly turning to a worried expression. Before you, who knew you had a medical degree? A smug smirk on Murray's face was all 𝐲𝐴 needed to know that the other adult was happy and wasn't upset. The happy look returned to Izuku's face, and he ran to Murray. I healed the bruise. Aizawa-sensei said I had to disconnect the nerves, And then, 𝐬𝐡𝐤 dived right into a mumble storm and Murray simply shook his head happily. He moved to the living room and grabbed the 3 kits off a high shelf. The sound of the contents moving inside snapped 𝐬𝐡𝐤 out of it, and the 8-year-old rushed over. 𝐲𝐴 wasn't far behind. 𝗳𝗲𝗃. 𝐬𝐡𝐤 woke up and noticed straight away that 𝗵𝘃𝗃 was conspicuously absent. Listening carefully, he heard the sounds of a defeated man. Slowly he creeped out of his room and looked down the hall. His hands flew to his mouth to keep from laughing as he looked at the scene in front of him. 𝗵𝘃𝗃 had stolen 𝐼𝑍𝐼's sleeping bag and was sleeping on it. The owner was laying on the floor face down. So 𝐬𝐡𝐤 walked over and lifted up some of the long raven hair, only to scream as he was dragged by the foot to the ground by the man, who started laughing. Murray was turned away, covering his mouth on his position on the couch, laptop in his lap. 𝐬𝐡𝐤 started to wiggle his foot out of the hold and started to giggle a little as 𝐼𝑍𝐼 let go and rolled onto his back. "Morning, 𝐬𝐡𝐤. Did you have a good dream?" The boy climbed onto the couch and nodded. "The results of the kits are here. Let's decide who goes first." After a round of rock, paper, scissors, it was decided. Murray would go first, then 𝐼𝑍𝐼, and finally 𝐬𝐡𝐤. Murray moved to the center of the couch and pulled up the sight as the 2 other males got on either side of him. "That's your mom," 𝐬𝐡𝐤 pointed at the familiar face. "Yep, and there's my brother, me, my dad, and my grandparents." The list goes on. Murray looked at his family tree, a small part of him happy that there wasn't any family drama he'd accidentally dug up. Murray switched to 𝐲𝐴's family tree. It wasn't as traced. There was a relative here and there, but not a lot. "Where's all the people?" 𝐬𝐡𝐤 looked at 𝐼𝑍𝐼. "With this site, you need the family members to be listed in it, or they had to have taken the kit," 𝐼𝑍𝐼 said. Honestly, he could care less about his biological family. They weren't important. Murray took a deep breath and clicked onto 𝐬𝐡𝐤's results. Both the adults' eyes widened. 𝐬𝐡𝐤's family tree was heavily traced. Hell, they could see all the way into the first generation of Quirk users. That's a lot of people. 𝐬𝐡𝐤 sounded nervous. "Wait, that's not Grandpa, and those aren't Mom's parents." 𝐬𝐡𝐤 pointed at his father and mother's images. Murray looked at the images before double-clicking 𝐸𝐻𝐤's image. It popped up with a piece of information that made his heart ache. 𝐸𝐻𝐤 𝐍𝐵𝐾. Current age, 33. Maiden name, 𝐸𝐻𝐤 𝐍𝐵𝗎. Given up at birth by her mother. Adopted by the 𝐵𝘃𝗏 family. Has a son named 𝐸𝐻𝐤 with 𝐀𝐦 𝐍𝐵𝗏. Last edited, July 15, 2200. That was 𝐸𝐻𝐤's birthday. He supposed that 𝐸𝐻𝐤 had filled her own information out on the day of 𝐸𝐻𝐤's birth, and that the site automatically changed the current age. He made a mental note to switch her to listed as deceased. Swallowing hard, Murray then clicked onto 𝐸𝐻𝐤's name. 𝐀𝐦 𝐍𝐵𝗏. Current age, 34. Was reported missing at the age of 6 by his father and mother. Youngest of 4. Married to 𝐸𝐻𝐤 𝐸 October 19, 2199. 𝐬𝐡𝐤 was a honeymoon baby. Murray quickly pushed out that mental image from his mind. As he started tracing up 𝐬𝐡𝐤's mother's side, 𝐬𝐡𝐤 was watching from beside him. Nana Shimura. Status: killed by a villain. Was a pro hero. Kotaro Shimura. Status: killed in a villain attack. It also took the lives of his family. There were no survivors. Murray frowned. 𝐬𝐡𝐤 was the last one of the Shimura line, but the figure they were looking for wasn't on this side. So he started tracing up 𝐸𝐻𝐤's side. They had made it up to the first generation of Quirk users when they finally found their match. Barry Shigaraki. Born December 25, 1995. Quirk, one for all. Died December 27, 2020. He was only 25 when he died. 𝐲𝐴's voice was quiet. It says he had severe health issues, and he died in a Quirk riot after he collapsed in the street when his heart started to fail. There's images of his older brother holding him after he died. He married his wife at 19. And they had a daughter when he was 22. Murray read off the site, then clicked on the link to pictures. The image was of a tall, curly-haired man holding Barry in bridal style, tears streaming down his face. Barry was curled up against his older brother's chest. The background was filled with what Murray assumed were rioters. Everyone seemed to have cloth masks on. From what Murray could guess, a reporter had snapped the photo in order to show the horrors of the riots. Nothing said horror more than an older brother carrying his dead little brother who had been trampled by the crowd. 𝐬𝐡𝐤 frowned. His brother looks really sad. Murray, however, could swear he had seen the older brother from somewhere. Maybe a case file? But that was impossible. The brother would have to be 200 years old by now. Murray, yellow eyes flickered to black ones. You're mumbling just as much as Izuku does. Izuku giggled from the side and Murray pushed Aizawa with one hand. Shut up. Izuku took the laptop and started trailing down. He wanted to know what it said about him. He paused at his father's family. A family of 4. An older brother, an older sister, another older sister, and then his father. Izuku clicked on the eldest picture. Sesshomaru Chisaki. Male. Age 43. Unmarried. No children. Quirk. Remold. Izuku clicked on the second eldest's picture. Tsukika Chisaki. Female. Age 41. Divorced. Doesn't have custody of her 3 daughters. Quirk. Claymaker. Izuku tilted his head slightly. Remold. Claymaker? What were those Quirk names? He clicked on the third child. Meguro Chisaki. Female. Deceased. Age at time of death 8. Quirk. Rebuild. Killed in a Quirk accident. Izuku reread his father's profile. Then it clicked. Overhaul, or at least destroying and remaking things, was a common quirk in the family. Remold could possibly mean that he could change things' shapes. Claymaker was probably similar. Rebuild was probably similar to Overhaul. Izuku turned to Murray and 𝐲𝗧𝗏, who were talking in English. I want to meet my aunt and uncle. Murray suddenly whipped around to face Izuku. What? He seemed more surprised than upset. Well, I looked at their profiles and I figured out that Overhaul kinda runs in the family. They might be able to help with it. 𝐲𝗧𝗏 gave a slight nod of thought. Murray sighed lightly. It probably won't hurt to meet them at least once. Right? Izuku swung his legs back and forth in the seat, watching the front doors for a red-headed, auburn, or brown-headed pair of siblings. He couldn't remember what color his aunt and uncle's hair was. Murray was sitting next to him and was messing around on his phone. Izuku could tell Murray was nervous. He was nervous too, but excitement overpowered the fear and worries as he waited. The door opened and 2 people walked in, looked around, and their eyes settled on the 2 green-haired males. As the 2 made their way over, Izuku looked them up and down. Sesshomaru was tall. Very tall. Taller than 𝐀𝐦. He had a muffin-top hairstyle, and there was heavy amounts of stubble on his face. His curly hair was a dark red color, and his eyes a familiar golden hue. He looked like a farmer. Tsukika was tall, but was shorter than her brother, around 𝐀𝐻's height. She had brown hair and lime-colored eyes. Her hair was down, and she was dressed like she just came from a cocktail party. Izuku felt uncomfortable when the 2 made a beeline towards him. Their eyes locked on him. Sasaki Murray, right? Sesshomaru was the first to speak. His voice sounded rough and Izuku clung to Murray's arm as he scooted away from his aunt, who was invading his bubble. A lot. Awa, he's so cute. Like 𝐀𝐻 when he was a little guy, you know, before he started talking. She sounded like a classic witch villain from the movies. Izuku watched her like a hawk. Yes. I'm Sasaki Murray. I'm guessing you are Izuku's aunt and uncle. Murray moved closer to the wall and pulled Izuku with him. Yep, and he's so cute. Tsukika was smiling as she sat across from the 2. Calm your ovaries, Tsukika. Sesshomaru sat down as well. No. Murray sighed internally. This was a mistake. If you don't mind, I have a few questions about Chisaki 𝐀𝐻. Both siblings suddenly had a disgusted look the second the man's name was said. Murray thought he might actually be able to get along with them, considering their seeming hatred of Izuku's genetic donor. Go ahead. Tsukika finally looked at Murray. Izuku quickly fished Murray's phone out of the man's pocket, who assumed Izuku was going for the games and unlocked it one-handedly. Izuku thanked him quietly and moved to the messaging app and found his teacher's name. Quickly, he started texting him. Murray, can you come to Nightingale's cafe? This is Izuku, by the way. 𝐲𝗏𝗏. Izuku? Is something wrong? Why do you have Murray's phone? Murray, can you come? My aunt and uncle are creepy. I don't feel safe. 𝐲𝗏𝗏. Okay, I'll make my way over there now. Stay by Murray no matter what happens. Izuku turned the phone off and gave it back to Murray, finally tuning into the conversation. It said he went missing at the age of 6. What happened? Murray had a notepad on the table and a pen in one hand. He was writing this down. It was a bad day. Mom was drunk and Dad was at home. We were taking 𝐀𝐻 to school, and next thing we know, he's missing. Both green-haired males felt like they were lying. Izuku clung to Murai's arm tightly, squeezing it. Murai wondered if he could come up with some sort of excuse on why they have to leave, but it seemed like something, or rather someone, came to his rescue. "Hello, Sasaki. I'm sorry I was late. Traffic was busy today." Aizawa had his hair pulled into a low ponytail, and he sat down on Izuku's other side. Izuku's tight grip relaxed a bit. "Sasaki?" Sesshomaru looked at the two, seemingly judging. "Who's this?" "I'm Aizawa 𝐬𝐴. I'm Izuku's trainer." 𝐬𝐴 came up with an answer before Murai. "Trainer?" Sukuka held a hand to her cheek. "Why would a child need?" It clicked, and her eyes widened. Within seconds, she was standing up and leaning over the table. "Does he have Kai's quirk?" Murai saw the cafe patrons immediately turn towards them, some glaring, and apologized for the woman's outburst, who simply blushed and sat down. "But yes, he does. He also has his mother's quirk, small object attraction." Murai felt like something was off. "Since you know about your brother's quirk, I'm guessing you saw how it came in, correct?" The siblings nodded sadly. "Yes, it was a normal day like any other." "Got you." Kai let out a yelp as arms wrapped around his midriff, and a raspberry was blown on his cheek by his sister. He giggled happily and pushed against her to try and escape. "Nuo, let me go." The 8-year-old laughed and let her 4-year-old brother go, who ran to his nightstand drawer, pulled something out and handed it to his older sister. It was a wrapped gift. "This is for you, Meguro." "Awa Kai, you're so sweet." She moved her red hair behind her ear and unwrapped the gift. A small wooden dog toy. Kai smiled at her happily. "Did you make this?" Kai nodded happily. His hands began to itch, but he ignored it. His sister offered him a hand, a trick he knew would lead to him being hugged, but he took it away. He wishes he didn't. He wishes he could forget the red stain on his floor and wall that used to be his sister. He wishes he never had a quirk. He wishes he never took her hand. "Kai, what did you do?" Murai was left horrified by the end of the story. Chisaki Kai had accidentally killed his sister when he was younger, and it seems his siblings blame him entirely. "So, you gave him up to a different family?" 𝐬𝐴 spoke. Murai could hear the small traces of venom in the man's words. The siblings looked at him in shock. "Different family?" "No, he went missing." Sesshomaru looked confused. They were telling the truth about him going missing. It appears that he was taken in by a Yakuza family then. 𝐬𝐴 felt Izuku hide his face in his side and laid an arm over him. Sukuka scoffed. Of course he'd go villain after what he did to Meguro. She folded her arms and held her nose up. "Aizawa-sensei, can we go to the ice cream shop across the street?" The small voice was quiet, but 𝐬𝐴 heard him loud and clear. "Yeah, let's go. We'll come back in a bit." 𝐬𝐴 stood up, picked Izuku up, and left the cafe. Murai turned to the two Chisaki siblings to continue their conversation when Sesshomaru spoke first. "We want legal custody of Izuku." The man looked dead serious. Murai could have sworn that had he been eating or drinking at that time, he would have choked on whatever it was. "Excuse me?" Murai didn't notice the venom leaking into his voice at the thought of his kid being taken from him by people who scared him. Izuku didn't even like them. "Well, we're his only living family like you said earlier. He obviously can't go back to his father. So it would make sense for us to take him." Sukuka spoke. It felt like they had rehearsed this. Then, Murai remembered what Detective Tsukachi had told him a few days after they found Izuku. He had called anyone under the last name Chisaki. No picked up, and no one returned his calls. That caught the siblings under that net at least. "Why didn't you try earlier?" "Detective Tsukachi left you a voicemail when we found Izuku almost 4 years ago." The eldest shrugged. "I thought it was a prank call, so I deleted the message." The three adults argued for a bit before the eldest stood up. He was glaring at Murai with a hatred the hero had only seen in villains he fought. "It doesn't matter what you want. Izuku is a Chisaki." The sister stood up next, allowing the brother to get out of the booth. "He needs to stay with his blood family, not some sidekick." With that jab, the two left. Murai was left staring off into space. They had planned this. It was never about meeting their nephew. It was about taking him whether he liked it or not. He pulled from his thoughts by a gentle pulling on his sleeve. When he looked down, a smile cracked onto his face. Izuku had brought him a small tub of ice cream. He gently took the sealed tub from his boy's hands and scooped him up into a tight hug. An idea suddenly shot through Murray. An idea he had in the back of his mind since Izuku was 6. "Hey, Izuku?" The small boy made a noise of acknowledgement. Murray pulled away a bit to see his son's face. "Do you want to legally become a Sasaki?" The idea of adopting Izuku had always been in the back of Murray's mind. But he wasn't sure on how to bring it up with Izuku, without sounding like he was trying to take him away from his previous family. The good parts of his family, at least. "Does that mean I'll be Sasaki Izuku instead of Chisaki Izuku?" Izuku tilted his head to the side lightly. "Yes." "And?" Izuku paused. He looked like he was debating on what he was about to say. "You'll be my dad?" "Yep." Murray felt his heart melt as the widest smile spread across his kid's face and arms quickly wrapped around his neck for a tight hug, which he gladly responded back to. "You're the best dad ever." Izuku's words made the brightest smile come onto Murray's face. He didn't even care if the press saw it.